Since the threat of the stone hive had been eliminated, a signal was sent to the First Army that the path was clear. Not too long after that, a long column of vehicles appeared on the road that stretched far below, on the other side of the mountain. One of the divisions was proceeding with haste to its next destination. The irregulars themselves were busy with collecting soul shards from the Stain abominations. A dozen heavy loaders arrived to drag the carcass of the remnant of the Jade Queen away. Even in death, a corrupted tyrant was extremely valuable. Its impenetrable carapace and other parts had a lot of uses for advanced spelltech applications. Sunny would not be surprised if some of the Jade Beetle ended up being used to bolster the defenses of one of the siege capitals, most likely Falcon Scott itself. After some time, Master Jet left for the base camp where the APCs were parked in order to contact the Army Command. Since there was nothing for Sunny to do at the summit of the mountain, he followed her and climbed into the Rhino to rest. There, sitting on his comfortable bed, Sunny finally summoned the runes. A transcendent memory. Ah, let's see. Soon, his eyes gleamed. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 869 Sin of Solace. Chapter 869, Sin of Solace. The runes shimmered in the air. Memory, Sin of Solace. Memory rank, Transcendent. Memory tier, V. Memory type, Weapon. Looking at ethereal weave of symbols, Sunny felt a cold shiver running down his spine. A weapon. The Sin of Solace was the third transcendent memory he had received. However, it was of a higher tier than both the Undying Chain and the Dying Wish combined. More than that, it was a weapon, something that could express its power much more directly than an armor or a charm. Something that he desperately needed here in the cold expanse of Antarctica. A weapon bestowed by the slaying of a corrupted tyrant had to be truly powerful. Holding his breath, he continued to study the runes. Memory description: this blade is a whisper of Ariel, the demon of dread, who turned a beautiful monster into a queen and gave her a sinister gift of forbidden knowledge. Sunny tilted his head, suddenly excited. The demon of dread, another demon? There are 5 of them I know of now. Demon of fate, demon of hope, demon of choice, demon of dread. Wait, who was the 5th one? He strained his memory for a while, and then scratched the back of his head. Oh, right. The demon of oblivion. How did I forget? Sunny pondered about the fact that the demon of oblivion was so forgettable for a bit. Then, he slightly shook his head. In any case, if this memory was connected to a demon, it had to be immensely powerful. His heart started to beat faster. Memory enchantments: Sinister Whisper, Perfect Jade, Omen of Dread, Hideous Truth, Cursed. Sunny blinked. Wait, what? Cursed? What did that mean, cursed? Somewhat disturbed, he decided to read the description of the last enchantment first. Soon, an ugly expression appeared on his face. Cursed, enchantment description: this blade slowly drives its wielder mad. What the hell? His new shiny transcendent weapon had come with side effects? What kind of crap is this? Since when do memories have flaws? Mad, it wants to drive me mad? We'll see who goes mad first, damn it. Glancing at the runes with resentment, Sunny decided to study the other enchantments before coming to conclusions. Sinister Whisper, enchantment description: this blade can deal both physical damage and mental damage to those that it cuts, destroying not only their bodies, but also their minds. The mental damage persists like a curse, even after a single cut. He grunted. How insidious. Mental attacks were almost as rare as soul attacks, and equally as hard to defend against. There was something terrifying about them, too, especially to those beings that were very hard to kill or nearly immortal. After all, what was the point of living if one's sanity was gone? A blade like that, truly, it would have been a bane of someone like the Eternal Chain Lords of the Kingdom of Hope. If only the damned memory did not deal the same mental damage to the wielder. Sunny grimaced, and then continued to read the runes. Perfect Jade, enchantment description. This blade is carved from a piece of sublime jade, and as such is sharp and durable beyond logic and reason. Straightforward. Omen of dread, enchantment description. A faint remnant of Ariel's presence lingers on this blade, striking terror into the hearts of all beings. Sunny frowned. Another mental attack enchantment, but this one is passive and affects an area. Not bad, should work wonders when Nightmare is around, too. Finally, the last one made him frown. Hideous truth, enchantment description. The more the wielder's sanity is shattered, the more powerful this blade becomes. It bestows revelations of madness on those who give in to its will. Sunny sighed. Damnation. So, basically, this already formidable weapon could grow many times more terrifying, but only if the person wielding it went completely insane. Conveniently, the Sin of Solace also drove anyone who wielded it to madness, thus providing an easy solution to unlocking the potential of the hideous truth. What am I supposed to do with this thing? And what does that mean, give in to its will? Does this cursed sword have a will of its own? While Sunny liked to joke that he was a bit crazy, he did not really want to turn into a raving lunatic. He lingered for a few minutes, then took a deep breath and summoned his new memory into existence. Soon, a beautiful Xuanshou Jian appeared in his hands. It was a straight, thin double-edged greatsword with a narrow guard and a graceful blade that gradually tapered to a sharp tip. Despite the fact that it was almost as long as Sunny was tall, the Sin of Solace surprisingly did not weigh much. In fact, it was as light as a feather. Its hilt was carved out of black obsidian, and the blade itself was stark white, with beautiful patterns etched on it. Despite the description of the perfect jade enchantment, it did not seem rigid as stone. Instead, it was both hard and flexible in perfect proportion. A sword such as this was nimble and swift, but also capable of dealing devastating damage. Despite its breathtaking beauty, however, as soon as Sunny touched the cool obsidian hilt, it was as though someone whispered into his ear. He shivered and turned around, only to find that there was nothing behind him. The whisper, however, did not disappear. It continued to flow from somewhere just out of reach, too quiet to discern any words, for now. Sunny felt that if he just concentrated hard enough, he would be able to understand what the rustling voice was saying. And it was important, very important, to understand it. There was a meaning to them that he just had to know. Had to. Before Sunny noticed, his body was covered in cold sweat. He stared at the Sin of Solace with a complicated expression, and then summoned the undying chain. As soon as the bleak armor wrapped itself around his body, the insidious whisper seemed to grow weaker. Sunny was only slightly obsessed with listening to it now. Ah, good. The chains of longing, enchantment of the transcendent armor provided him with a high protection against mind attacks, and the cursed attribute of the beautiful gem seemed to be just that. A strange and sinister mind attack aimed at the sword's own wielder. Which meant that Saint, who was completely immune to mind attacks, would be able to use the jade sword without any problem. Sunny was sufficiently certain what he would be able to withstand the tantalizing whispers if need be, as well. It was a small price to pay for being able to wield such a frightening transcendent weapon. If push comes to shove, I can afford to lose a bit of sanity, too. I mean, what's wrong with going a little mad? Been there, done that. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 870 To-Do List. Chapter 870, To-Do List. Dismissing the beautiful sword, Sunny breathed a sigh of relief. The insidious whispers assaulting his mind disappeared, leaving only a lingering sense of chill and unease behind. The pressure of the call was already enough to drive a person insane. Adding the curse of the Sin of Solace to this burden was not for the weak of heart. Well, whatever. I'll just let Saint use it for now. He was impressed by the cursed blade, though. Its fundamental properties were already fearsome enough, considering that this transcendent weapon's sharpness and durability were further enhanced by the perfect jade enchantment. It also synergizes well with Nightmare's Dreadlord attribute and the Mantle of Fear ability. What made it so alluring to Sunny was the mental damage it dealt, though. Mind attacks were an insidious thing. While not as obviously destructive as more straightforward elemental damage types and not as universally deadly and hard to defend against as soul attacks, they possessed one frightening quality. The more sentience a being possessed, the more that being stood to be damaged by a mind attack. What it meant was that while lesser nightmare creatures, beasts and monsters, would not be as susceptible to the sinister whisper, the truly dangerous foes, demons, devils, tyrants, terrors, and humans, would suffer terribly from it. And since those were the enemies Sunny was wary of the most, the Sin of Solace was a perfect tool to satisfy his needs. I just have to be careful not to suffer terribly myself. But even if he did, at least he would be reaping the benefits of the hideous truth. Sunny felt that the cursed sword would become truly terrifying if its wielder managed to unlock that strange enchantment. At its full force, maybe the Sin of Solace would be powerful enough to strike down even great nightmare creatures. Or supreme humans. With a wistful sigh, Sunny decided to check his progress in other areas, since he already had the runes summoned. Shadow Fragments 870/4000. Not bad. After being stuck at 744/4000 for half a year, he had gained more than 100 fragments in just 2 days. If this continued, Sunny would become a tyrant in a not-so-distant future. Of course, if he continued to fight at that intensity every day, he would also probably be dead by then. Somewhat reassured, he shifted his gaze to the mantle of the underworld. Vanquished Foes 4555/6000. The monumental task of satisfying the requirement of the Prince of the Underworld enchantment was nearing its final stage. With how many nightmare creatures ran rampant in Antarctica, Sunny would certainly be able to complete it soon. Now that his identity as Mongrel was, most likely, known to the members of his cohort, there should be no problem wearing the mantle more often. He still did not know how the onyx armor would grow after the limit was reached, but hoped to see something incredible. Then, Sunny concentrated on his shadows, starting with Saint. Shadow Fragments 101/200. Saint was already halfway to becoming a saint. Or a transcendent demon, to be more precise. He could not even imagine how powerful she would be once he collected enough memories, or echoes, to feed to his loyal knight. Still, 100 or so ascended memories was not a small amount. Luckily, he could also use memories of lesser ranks, although the process would be much slower in that case. Finally, he read the runes describing Nightmare. Shadow Fragments 14/600. He sighed. To be honest, Sunny had not been very diligent about feeding his steed. For some reason, the Black Courser required much more fragments to ascend than Saint had needed, maybe because he was already a terror, or maybe because Saint had come from a race created by Nether, the Prince of the Underworld. In any case, Sunny felt that helping her become transcendent was more important than elevating Nightmare to an ascended terror. Especially considering that his terror ability, Dream Curse, was still locked. And speaking about that ability, at least there had been more progress on that front. Nightmares required 112/1000. His steed had already subjugated more than 100 nightmares, both making himself stronger and growing closer to unlocking the Dream Curse. Of course, that task was still far from being over, but Sunny had a feeling that there would be a lot of progress soon. Antarctica was in the throes of a cataclysm that had become known as the Chain of Nightmares, after all. It was bound to breed a lot of them. Better yet, up until now, the Black Steed had been limited to only subjugating nightmares of masters, simply because awakened humans did not dream. Awakened nightmare creatures did, however. Which meant that Nightmare would be able to plant seeds of fear into their souls, and then visit the dreams of those abominations that had survived the encounter to harvest them. Maybe I should let him loose more often. And that was that, more or less. His own shadow fragments, that of Saint and Nightmare, the Prince of the Underworld, enchantment, and the Dream Curse. These were the things he needed to concentrate on. Then there were other things, his arsenal of memories, the power of his cohort, and the equipment of its members. Oh. And he also had to survive, somehow. I probably will. Sunny had made a lot of progress, but there was a lot more progress still to be made. Luckily, Antarctica was just the place to make it. It had an inexhaustible reserve of nightmare creatures of all kinds, with numerous new ones soon to arrive. As long as one could stay alive, there were countless opportunities for growth. Master Jet had been right. This campaign was going to shift the balance of power across all of humanity. Many new champions would emerge, many renowned warriors would become even stronger. Many would die. Thinking about that, Sunny suddenly felt somber. Now, he was even more convinced that the great clans would not be able to stay away from the chain of nightmares for long. He just had to make the best of it before they arrived. Then 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 871 Wild Imaginations. Chapter 871 Wild Imaginations. 1,000 duels, undefeated. He even went against Morgan of Valor before ascending. No way. What do you mean, no way? The recordings are all over the network, dude. No, Luster is right. I don't know much about the dreamscape, but it is a fact that he contained a manifesting gate as an awakened. Alone. I also heard that he is a bastard son of a saint from the House of Night, maybe even of Nightwalker himself. Actually, some say that he was created in a secret government laboratory from the DNA of powerful nightmare creatures. But the research was abandoned, with all records destroyed, because he was the only test subject who did not go completely mad. I've heard that he is a woman, though? Does he look like a woman, you idiot? Well, now that you say it, he is strangely petite. Has anyone seen Captain undressed? Belle. Did you get hit in the head during the last battle? Keep your voices down. You'll wake him up. Already awake, Sunny was laying on his comfortable bed and listening to his subordinates gossip at the front of the steadily moving rhino. His expression was hard to describe. These fools. He had expected that much from Luster, but Kimmy? Not to mention Belle. Belle was supposed to be their reasonable senior, damn it. With a sigh, Sunny rose, threw a neutral glance at the suddenly quiet trio, and then went to the kitchen to make some coffee. He poured himself a cup of the fragrant drink, added some synthetic sugar to it, then sat down in the lounge area of the APC and took a delighted sip. Throughout all of it, 3 pairs of eyes were following his every move. Sunny shifted slightly, then looked at them in return. What? Is there something on my suit? His black bodysuit had already repaired the tears it received in the battle against the Stone Hive. Its smart fabric was truly something else. The more Sunny wore it, the more he understood how well designed this unusual uniform was. One could argue whether it was dapper or not, but overall, he was extremely satisfied with his new equipment. Hearing his question, Kim and Luster suddenly looked away with furtive expressions. No. It's nothing. You look great today, Captain. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Belle, meanwhile, continued to stare at him with a strange expression. For some reason, Sunny suddenly felt an impulse to cover his chest with an arm. He frowned. Anything you want to ask? The swordsman simply nodded and smiled. Yeah. Captain, are you mongrel? Luster and Kim flinched and looked at him with horror. Sunny, meanwhile, scowled. Who are you calling a mongrel, bastard? Belle shook his head. No, I mean, are you Lord Mongrel? You know, that guy? Damn. As expected. Truth be told, the moment the question had been asked, he had no choice but to answer. Sunny just stalled a little to collect his thoughts. He shrugged. Oh. Yeah, that's me. Then, Sunny took a sip of his coffee with an absolutely nonchalant expression. Luster and Kimmy, meanwhile, were staring at him in shock. Their eyes were as wide as saucers. For a few long moments, there was nothing but dead silence. Sunny enjoyed his drink for a bit, and then scratched the back of his head. But don't tell anyone. It's a secret. I wasn't really supposed to become known to the public, you know? Their expressions slowly changed. A hint of grave understanding appeared in their eyes. The three looked at each other, and then Kim resolutely nodded. Of course, Captain. We will keep silent about who you really are. We'll tell Samara, Quentin, and Dorn, too. Don't worry. Sunny nodded with satisfaction. Isn't it great to have such understanding minions? Of course, he had no idea what it was that they thought they understood. But that was the beauty of it, he did not need to. The best and most convincing lies were those that people built in their heads themselves. Human imagination was a wild thing, whatever idiotic theory his soldiers decided to believe, be it that their captain was a secret love child of a famous saint or a product of a forbidden government experiment, it was all good with him. The point was that they would keep it to themselves. Just like that, a few more people learned that he was mongrel. Sunny felt a bit sad about that fact. On the bright side, it seemed that he would have no problem summoning the mantle of the underworld in the future, at least not when the cohort acted independently of other human forces. Luster, too, was looking at him with a newfound reverence. If there was one inconvenient thing about the revelation that Captain Sunless was, in fact, the famous Lord Mongrel, it was that Belle kept throwing strange glances at Sunny. What the hell? With a friendly smile, Sunny took his cup of coffee and returned to the back of the Rhino. Climbing back onto the bed, he then took out his communicator. There, a new message was waiting for him. As his smile grew a little wider, Sunny concentrated on the lines of text. Rain, hey, Sunny. How are you doing? Everyone is talking about the Southern Quadrant campaign, that is where you went, right? Are you an officer now? Tell me so that I could brag about it in school. One of my classmates' sister is apparently an ace MWP pilot. She won't shut up, stop talking about it. Anyway, are you doing well? The news says that everything is going great, but my dad seems very stressed. I don't think I've ever seen him so tense. Oh, I am doing well, myself. A few kids in my class stopped coming to school, so I guess they are at the Awakened Academy now. But I am not showing any symptoms, yet. I am practicing my archery and swordsmanship every day, though. You'll be proud of your pupil. Sunny reread the message a few times. Then finished his coffee, grinned, and started composing a response. Sunny, hey. An officer? Gods, who do you think I am? Of course I am. Let me tell you, I am a captain of the most elite unit in the whole army. I have a bunch of powerful awakened under me, and a reputation so fearsome that other masters want to be my friends. The Devil of Antarctica, that's what they call me. Well, I'm sure someone does, maybe. Just yesterday, an actual saint personally expressed gratitude to me. I will probably get a medal soon, too. Oh, I am also in charge of a cutting-edge armored personnel carrier called the Rhino. You won't believe how amazing it is. Let me describe it. First of all, 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 872 Spreading Nightmares. Chapter 872 Spreading Nightmares. The initial several weeks of the Antarctica campaign were the most intense, at least for now. The divisions of the First Army steadily moved south, fighting through the swiftly growing swarms of nightmare creatures and establishing strategic encampments along the way. These encampments were going to serve as the transit points of the evacuation networks soon. Moving through them, all the population of the Antarctic Center was going to be relocated to the siege capitals to await eventual salvation. The same thing, only on a much larger scale, was happening in East Antarctica, where most people of the Southern Quadrant lived. As days went by, the chain of nightmares grew more rampant. New gates manifested with increased frequency, disgorging more and more abominations into the waking world. Luckily, the burden pressing down on the First Army also grew lighter, since more and more divisions reached their destinations and entrenched themselves inside the cities that would become humanity's strongholds in the coming months. Without the need to brave the enemy-infested wilderness, the lives of the soldiers became less perilous. That was not to say that they were not terribly busy. Turning a populous city into a wartime fortress was a laborious task, too. However, no one was as busy as the first irregular company. Just like Master Jet had promised, the irregulars almost never rested. While other soldiers had specific tasks that sometimes forced them into battle with the nightmare creatures, and sometimes did not, the 7 cohorts of irregulars constantly moved between various flashpoints to douse their flames. Day after day, battle after battle, soon, the novelty of Antarctica's sobering reality dissipated, and the endless procession of combat engagements blurred into one continuous, bloody ordeal. They were doing their job, still. Not all battles were as large-scale or as dire as those in the first 2 days of the active operation. Some demanded more precision than all-out effort, others simply had to be fought because no one else could be spared to address the situation. Tempered in this terrible crucible, Sunny and his cohort were becoming accustomed to the trials of the chain of nightmares, as well as each other. Their ability to fight as a single cohesive entity increased, finally reaching a satisfactory level. Their personal power grew, too. Sunny was not the only one who had managed to enhance his arsenal of memories, for one. With so many nightmare creatures that needed to be slaughtered, each member of the cohort acquired new combat tools. Quentin, for example, had received a beautiful suit of plate armor for killing a fallen officer of the Stonehive. Just like the carapaces of the monstrous insects, it was pure white and incredibly durable. Luster managed to acquire a charm that was supposed to increase his luck, even if no one could really tell whether it actually worked or not. Samara was now wearing a chameleon cape that blended into the environment and masked her position. Others were using new memories, too. Armed with them, the cohort managed to survive these perilous weeks without suffering any casualties. The swiftly racked up kills and contribution points, as well as soul shards and reputation among the soldiers of the First Army. However, their fearsome reputation paled in comparison to that of Mongrel, who was slowly turning into somewhat of an urban myth. Sunny had had no plans of unleashing his weird alter ego again so soon, but the circumstances forced him to make a different decision. There was just too much for him to do. Often, several missions of utmost importance appeared simultaneously, and since he could not be in 2 places at the same time, he sent Nightmare and Saint to take care of the easier ones instead. This approach turned out to be surprisingly effective. Armed with the Sin of Solace, which synergized extremely well with both of them, his shadows had become a real menace on the battlefield. They were also able to traverse the mountainous terrain of the Antarctic center with great speed, allowing Sunny to dispatch them to complete missions that required speed above all else. Of course, these missions had to be on the lower spectrum of hardship. A transcendent weapon or not, Saint and Nightmare could not compare to the power of the cohort itself, especially since he led it personally. So while Sunny and his soldiers dealt with the most dangerous tasks, Mongrel popped up here and there without any discernible pattern, appearing from nowhere and disappearing without a trace after dealing devastating damage to the nightmare creatures and leaving only severed corpses behind. Suffice it to say, Saint's popularity among the rank and file of the First Army grew explosively. The Guardian Angel of Antarctica, that title, coined by a random network journalist, was spoken by them more and more often, jokingly at first, but then a bit less so. Sunny, meanwhile, finally earned his own nickname. Unsurprisingly, he was being called Devil now. Or, infuriatingly, Little Devil. The latter one, however, was only used by the other captains of the irregulars. No one else dared to speak it to his face, or behind his back, really, considering that the rumor that his young master was always watching and listening quickly spread through the army. Of course, not everything went well for the human force. The First Army experienced several painful setbacks. More soldiers fell. And more were critically wounded. The technical equipment was starting to grow less and less reliable as time went by, even if the most critical pieces worked as intended due to expensive spelltech countermeasures. It was getting harder and harder for the Awakened to find a safe place to sleep without being whisked away by the call. Worst of all, however, was the effect that the chain of nightmares exerted on mundane humans. Nephice had once told Sunny that each person infected by the spell carried a small seed of nightmare in their soul. And that those of them who failed to pass the first trial became a Category 1 gate themselves. The chain of nightmares increased the rate of gate manifestations manifold, and that rate, terribly, spread to mundane humans as well. Not only was there an anomalously high amount of young people falling prey to the spell in Antarctica, but also, for the first time in half a century, people outside the usual age of infestation started to succumb to the first nightmares en masse, as well. Which meant that, just like during the emergence of the first generation, no one was safe. Anyone could become infected, fail the trial of the spell, and turn into a murderous nightmare creature. The people locked inside the siege capitals, those being relocated through the evacuation corridors. Even the soldiers themselves. A tense and fearful atmosphere slowly settled over Antarctica. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 873, and full of terrors. Chapter 873, and full of terrors. Chilling darkness veiled Antarctica like a burial shroud. The twilight of the dusk had finally succumbed to the inevitable advent of the cruelly lasting absence of light, and the long night had come to the southern quadrant, pregnant with countless horrors. This night was going to last for many months, and by the end of it, who knew if any of the humans it embraced would still be alive? How many of them would be lucky enough to see the light of day again? Sunny had never experienced a night quite like that. The sun was gone, and the empty sky was full of brilliant stars. The pale visage of the moon lingered among them from time to time, coming and going as it pleased. Despite how dark and cold the world had become, it was strangely beautiful. Back in the alloy jungle of the northern quadrant siege capital, stars were rare guests. Light pollution kept them away. Similarly, there were no stars shining upon the cursed expanse of the forgotten shore. Antarctica was different. Despite the coming of the night, it only grew more dazzling. The stars, the moon, and the breathtaking tapestry of the aurora australis that shimmered above them as ethereal shades of green, blue, purple, and red flowed into each other, all of it was very beautiful. However, that beauty hid oppressive horror. Dread, that's the word to describe it. This is a land of dread. Sunny and his cohort were walking through the encampment of the first evacuation army, their armor covered in dents and painted by the blood of the nightmare creatures they had recently killed. The tense and tired soldiers hurried to get out of their way, throwing intense looks at the irregulars. Look, it's the devils. They're here. Thank the gods. Recently, they had become a comforting sight for the rank and file of the First Army. Wherever irregulars appeared, problems seemed to disappear and the number of casualties drastically fell. Of course, these victories had a cost. It's just that the soldiers weren't the ones paying it. With a grim expression on his face, Sunny glanced at Dorn, who was limping and seemed barely able to walk. The giant man's face was pale and covered in cold sweat. He had received a severe wound in the last battle. Even with Quinton's help, Dorn was going to be out of commission for at least several days. Which meant that they would be short a man should a new mission arrive. The campaign was still on track, but it was getting more dire with each day. The air in the encampment was full of fear and tension. More and more nightmare creatures poured into the waking world, and now that darkness reigned Antarctica unopposed, any area that was not illuminated by powerful spotlights could be hiding a deadly threat. Even then, the spotlights tended to flicker and break down spontaneously, which made even artificial light unreliable. People were constantly on edge and afraid of every shadow. After all, most couldn't see through them like Sunny. Even worse, danger lurked not only in the darkness outside, but also inside the fortified encampments. The spell was spreading through the ranks of mundane humans like a plague, and anyone could turn into a rampaging monster if left alone for too long. There was no real safety anywhere. If things are like that after just 1 month, how are we going to last the whole year? Shaking his head, Sunny looked ahead and caught a glimpse of the rhino. His eyelids suddenly grew heavy. He really needed rest. Despite the glum atmosphere in the camp, objectively, things were going reasonably well for the field army dispatched to the Antarctic Center. It had already advanced almost all the way to the southern edge of the narrow landmass. All but one division, the one Sunny and his cohort were assigned to, had already reached their destinations and were in the process of converting them into siege capitals. Evacuation networks had been established, with fortified transit outposts placed near the strategic points. Constant patrols maintained protected corridors for the armored convoys to ferry the civilians from smaller settlements into the handful of human strongholds. Up north, the relocation was already in full swing. Here in the south, however, it was only starting. Still, the first phase of the operation was well on its way. Maybe we'll get to relax behind a thick wall of a siege capital soon, too. Climbing into the Rhino, Sunny glanced at Kim. Status? She studied her military communicator. Army Command designated this camp as a green zone. Last check was 13 minutes ago. He nodded. A green zone was one with no gates close enough to affect the dream realm anchors of the awakened. People could sleep safely within its confines. Okay. Quentin, tend to Dorn. Kimmy, Luster, Samara, and Belle, enjoy the first sleep shift. I'll stand watch until you guys return. They nodded and soon disappeared inside the sleeping pods. Quentin got busy dealing with Dorn's injury, using both his aspect and an extensive medkit. Sunny, meanwhile, walked over to the command and communication suite and sat behind a console. He lingered for a moment, and then summoned his runes. Shadow Fragments, 1332/4000. Shadow Fragments, 133/200. Nightmares required, 209/1000. And finally, Vanquished Foes, 5523/6000. He had achieved a lot in the past month. So much, in fact, that exhaustion had seeped into his very bones. Sunny had long lost count of how many nightmare creatures he had slain, but it had to be a couple of thousands, at least. Even more if he counted those that Saint and Nightmare had hunted down. Mantle of the Underworld will probably be first. Even though he could not wear the Onyx armor in every battle, its counter was swiftly approaching the limit. Sunny sighed, and then dismissed the runes. Almost simultaneously, the symbol of an incoming communication appeared on the console's screen. He closed his eyes for a moment. Looks like a new mission is here, after all. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 874 One Last Mission. Chapter 874 One Last Mission. A moment later, a familiar face appeared on the screen. Despite the pressure of leading the first irregular company into the meat grinder of the Southern Quadrant campaign, Master Jet looked relaxed and at ease. Like she always did. No, actually, she almost seemed to look better than how she had back in the safe haven of the NQSC. It was as though the exhaustion that everyone in Antarctica felt could not touch her. The perpetual dark circles under her eyes were gone, and her whole presence appeared strangely invigorated. Sunny had a suspicion of why. Soul Reaper flashed him a bright smile. Hey, Sunny. How is it going? He simply nodded. We cleared that fallen nest. Dorn was wounded, though. He'll need a few days to recover. In the past month, his relationship with Master Jet had gradually changed. They grew a bit closer and more familiar with each other. That sense of camaraderie could only be forged by fighting side by side in numerous battles, and was only enhanced by the exceedingly rare background they shared. Wasn't it funny to see two outskirt rats leading the elite government awakened into battle? However, at the same time, after observing Soul Reaper in combat more, Sunny felt that he had come to understand the nature of her flaw. And it was a grim one, for sure. A long time ago, in a different lifetime, almost, before even the Forgotten Shore, Sunny had heard from teacher Julius that Master Jet was feared by many awakened. As the old man had put it, her problematic personality destroyed any chance she might have had of ever becoming a saint. Actually, the exact words he had used were, "Who would want to help a psychopathic killer become a saint?" Later, Sunny had learned more about the unspoken rules of the awakened society and came to believe that these rumors were just a pretense to justify the suppression of the sovereigns. A product of the contempt proud legacies felt toward a clanless nobody from the outskirts who dared to become stronger than them, and refused to bend the knee to their power. But now, he was not so sure. Sunny had seen that Jet possessed a bizarre ability to absorb the soul essence of those that she killed. He had also witnessed her powerful, but fractured core that constantly leaked essence like a broken vessel. Later, he also observed that she seemed to lack the ability to naturally regenerate essence, as all awakened could. And so, he now suspected that Soul Reaper's flaw forced her to constantly pursue murder. It seemed that killing was the only way for her to prevent her fractured core from becoming lifeless and empty. That would actually explain a lot of things, from the true reason she had chosen to come to Antarctica to why a girl from the outskirts, someone who had never been treated like a human by the government, would decide to become a dedicated government operative. Working for the authorities might not have been the most glamorous job, but if there was one thing it did not lack, it was an endless amount of targets that had to be killed. So, maybe those who treated Soul Reaper Jet like a person obsessed with killing were not wrong. They were just mistaken about the reason for her morbid obsession. Which posed a question: could he really trust her? What would happen if Soul Reaper's essence was running low, and Sunny was the only one around? If he was correct in his suspicion, of course. While Sunny was thinking about that, Master Jet grinned and waved her hand in front of the camera. In it was a strange charm. No, actually, it was just a mundane piece of jewelry. The thing looked like a golden circle with 4 stars engraved on it, beautiful filigree surrounding them, and a purple ribbon attached to the top. What the hell is that? Noticing his confusion, she shook her head. Gods, Sunny. Don't you know what that thing is? This is the Transcendent Star of Valor. The highest military decoration one can receive. It's your medal, fool. I finally managed to get the army command to issue it. Sunny blinked. Oh. That's great. Master Jet let out an exasperated sigh. It comes with a very sizable contribution point reward, too. Instantly, his expression livened. Oh. That's great. Finally satisfied, Soul Reaper nodded. It took some convincing to make happen. Anyway, I'll hold on to it until we meet in person. About that, plans changed a little, so you'll have to complete one more mission before that happens. Ah, but don't worry. This one is a calm one, so your man will have plenty of time to recover. Sunny stared at her with a dubious expression. Master Jet summoned the map of the Antarctic Center and highlighted several points on it. The division you're with is not going to proceed further south, since there are no big population centers there. However, there is a very important research installation at the southernmost point of the landmass. It's about 400 kilometers away from your current position. Sunny studied the map. The Antarctic Center resembled a gargantuan snake that sprawled across the ocean, and the installation Jet mentioned was situated at the very tip of its tail. What about it? She shrugged. Your mission is to reach the installation, secure the VIP currently residing there, and bring him back to the nearest siege capital. There is a garrison of local awakened commanded by a master at the installation, too. They will be responsible for evacuating the regular staff and scientists. You can choose to go back on your own, but that would be a jerk move, considering that they are expecting reinforcements to help them make the journey. Sunny thought for a bit, then nodded. Sounds easy. Yeah, no way. Something bad is definitely going to happen. Master Jet smiled. It does, doesn't it? In any case, after that is done, we will probably remain within the walls of siege capitals for a long time, and finally have time to rest. Good luck! 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 875 Old Roads. Chapter 875 Old Roads. The next day, Sunny and his cohort separated from the battered division. The mass of vehicles and soldiers marched down the broad highway, heading to a large city that was situated behind the mountain peaks to the cast. The Rhino, meanwhile, continued south. 400 kilometers, how long do you think it will take us to reach the research installation? Sunny was currently in the cabin of the APC, leaning on a bulkhead as he looked ahead. Luster glanced at him from the pilot's seat and shrugged hesitantly. Hard to say, sir. The terrain here is really rough, and we'll need to climb over many mountains before reaching the coastal plain. There are some old roads here and there, with tunnels that can serve as convenient shortcuts. But since no one took care of them for half a century, it's mostly a stone labyrinth. So, several days at the least. Maybe even a week if we want to be really careful and lower the risk of stumbling into a horde of nightmare creatures. He hesitated for a few moments, and then added, Of course, I can get us there in a day if we leave the mountains and drive along the coastal thoroughfare. Since most of the Antarctic center was mountainous in nature, moving across its expanse with speed was somewhat of a problem. It would have been much faster by air, but no one was suicidal enough to use an aircraft in these circumstances. The reason was very simple: it was impossible to load enough armor on a flying vehicle. Not only would its electronics and navigation be swiftly fried by the interference of the gates, but even worse than that, countless nightmare creatures in a 100-kilometer radius would be able to see and take the aircraft down. Since very few awakened could fight effectively in the air, being swarmed by winged abominations or taken down by a hail of ranged attacks from the ground was their worst nightmare. Still, that did not mean that there were no means of traversing the Antarctic center quickly. Since the terrain was much more flat near the coast, there was a convenient highway running along the shore of the cold ocean. It's just that traveling by it was not exactly safe, especially these days. The ocean, too, was overflowing with nightmare creatures. All kinds of horrors hid beneath its restless surface. Sunny sighed. No, let's not go anywhere near the coast. Avoid those old tunnels, too. Just take your time and take us over the mountains, Luster. Dorn needs time to recover, anyway. The young man smiled. Yes, sir. Will do, sir. Sunny gave him a bleak look and shook his head. Ever since the revelation of his identity as Mongrel, Luster had been acting as an overly enthusiastic sycophant. It was honestly a bit bothersome. Well, all right then. He walked back to the back of the rhino and sat down to meditate. In the past month, the importance of replenishing one's essence had become painfully clear to all awakened in Antarctica. There were just too many nightmares creatures around and too many battles that had to be fought. Maintaining one's reserves was often the difference between life and death. It was also an inescapable restriction that defined how often and how well one could fight. Sunny's essence capacity was roughly 4 times as vast as that of almost any other master, but the rate at which his soul restored it was only twice as fast. As a result, he needed 3 to 4 days to fully replenish it. Sleep, rest, and meditation helped, but who had time to rest in Antarctica? All of them had to get accustomed to fighting while suffering from a dire deficit of essence. That was another reason why the campaign grew harder as days went by, and why everyone was exhausted. His cohort was in a much better spot than most thanks to Luster, but Sunny himself had not been able to make use of the young man's extraordinary aspect. Luckily, they were not supposed to fight any serious battles in the next few days. That was already a blessing. Keeping his eyes closed, Sunny rested as his shadows scouted the route ahead. The rhino climbed the steep slopes of the mountain chain with agility that was surprising for a machine of that size. The aurora australis shimmered with ethereal lights in the black sky above it, but the mountains themselves were shrouded in darkness. Driving a heavy APC up and down the treacherous slopes at night was not for the faint of heart. Since one small mistake could send it plummeting down from a deadly height. Still, Luster seemed to be doing fine. He even had his lucky charm summoned, rubbing it from time to time with a nervous look. Everything seemed calm. Slowly but surely, they were moving toward their destination. Sunny made an effort to memorize as much of the landscape as he could, knowing that they might be coming back the same way after picking up the VIP at the research installation. The southern edge of the Transantarctic Mountains was, indeed, a real labyrinth. Tall peaks rose into the sky, with remnants of broken roads clinging to their slopes. Dark maws of tunnels that had been burrowed through the massive stone appeared from time to time, filling him with a sense of alarm. The roads, as well as the tunnels, had been constructed long before he was born, during the dark times. Back then, humanity had been busy destroying itself in a series of devastating wars as the world fell apart around it. Then, the nightmare spell came, and many things changed. The old roads were now abandoned and in a state of disrepair, but the rhino could still make use of them. The progress was slow, however, and it was only made slower by the need to avoid active gates and prowling swarms of nightmare creatures. In the end, it took them almost 4 days to traverse the mountains and descend to the coastal plain at the southern edge of the Antarctic center. From here, they could proceed to the destination at full speed. As the Rhino accelerated and flew across the plain, a powerful blizzard enveloped it, reducing the visibility almost to zero. That was when things started to go wrong. 64F449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 876 Lo 49. Chapter 876, LO 49. Sonny woke up with a start. The familiar sounds and vibrations of the Rhino told him that everything was okay, and that the vehicle was moving at high speed toward its destination. No one seemed to be attacking them. And yet, for some reason, he felt a sense of deep unease. Sonny frowned and rose from his bed, then went over to the pilot's cabin. On his way, he passed Kim, who was running diagnostics on the secondary control panel, and Samara, who was tinkering with her rifle on the workstation in the cargo bay. Reaching the front of the Rhino, Sonny silently looked through the armored windshield at the white wall of the blizzard that enveloped the world. Of course, he could have just accessed the feeds of external cameras from the command suite, but he trusted his own eyes much more. Nothing seemed out of place. He hesitated for a few moments, then spoke to Luster. "Did something happen just now?" The young man glanced at him in confusion.
No.
"Oh, there was a tiny spike of seismic activity a few minutes ago, but that's nothing unusual.
Happens all the time. Don't worry, sir, we'll reach the installation in about half an hour."
Sonny scowled. Good. He returned to the lounge area, poured himself a cup of coffee, and then walked over to the command suite. "Kimmy, contact the research facility.
Tell them we'll be arriving soon."
She paused the diagnostic software, activated the transmitter and sent a communication request to the installation they were approaching.
For a few minutes, there was only static on the channel.
Kim frowned, then repeated the call, this time extending the antennae of the Rhino to their full length.
Still, nothing. Sonny took a sip of coffee. What, no one's responding?
She studied the monitors, then said in a tentative tone.
"No, it's not that, it's just,
our signal doesn't seem to be coming through for some reason." He scratched the back of his back. "Contact Army Command then, ask them for an update on the installation's status." Kim did as she was told, but there was still no result.
Her face grew a little dim.
I can't contact Army Command either, sir.
All communications seem to be down." Sonny remained silent for a few moments. "So we're completely cut off from everyone? Is it because of the blizzard?"
Establishing a stable connection had grown a bit hard lately, but they were yet to experience a complete communication blackout. After all, Sonny had spent a ton of contribution points to upgrade the Rhino's comms array.
Kim hesitated. "I can't say, sir. A simple blizzard is not supposed to mess with the signal so much."
Sonny rubbed his face.
"That doesn't sound good."
He sighed, then sent his shadows out into the snowstorm. They spread around the speeding Rhino, searching for any sign of danger that could have been hiding in the white haze. However, no matter how hard the shadows looked, nothing seemed out of the ordinary.
Sonny remained on guard throughout the remainder of their journey.
Minutes passed by without anything happening. Soon, there was a soft sound and some movement in the lounge area. Belle, Quentin, and Dorn returned from the dream realm and climbed out of the sleeping nooks, looking rested and refreshed. Even though the big man still showed some discomfort, his injury was well on its way to being healed.
Just like that, half an hour flew by. Sonny caught sight of the research installation long before the powerful projectors of the Rhino flooded its gates with light. The facility looked more like a small fortress settlement than a scientific base.
It was perched dangerously close to the ocean shore, and had a thick wall surrounding it, with powerful turrets aiming at the dark waves. There was a large dome-like structure towering above the formidable fortress, painted white on the backdrop of the black sky.
It resembled a giant, perfectly smooth egg.
The facility had no official name, and was known simply as LO 49. Sonny had no idea what kind of research was being done on its premises, but considering that there was a sizable garrison of awakened guarding the installation, complete with an ascended commander, it had to be pretty important.
The best evidence that the scientists living here were doing very valuable work, though, was the fact that Sonny and his soldiers had been sent to retrieve them.
Luster, slow down. We're near.
The rhino gradually reduced its speed and approached the settlement. Beams of light soon illuminated a small fleet of transport vehicles parked in front of it, seemingly waiting to take the staff away as soon as the reinforcements arrived. For a moment, Sonny felt a pang of fear. It was as though the whole facility was empty, with only ghosts populating its streets. Then, however, the turrets above the gates moved, taking aim at the approaching APC. Powerful spotlights ignited on the wall, cutting through the snow and flooding the immediate area with stark light. The rhino drove to the fleet of transport vehicles and parked nearby. At the same time, the heavy gates of the fortress opened, and a lone human figure walked into the blizzard. With a sigh, Sonny opened the hatch of the rhino and climbed out into the cold. He walked forward and studied the stranger. The man was tall,
strong, and looked to be around 40.
He was dressed in a black bodysuit similar to one Sonny wore, with an unzipped parka resting on top of it. He had dark hair and calm, intelligent eyes. There was a composed expression on his stern and weary face. Overall, everything about the stranger spoke of experience and discipline.
Sonny stopped a few steps away and gave him a nod.
I am Ascended Sunless, captain of the 1st Irregular Company of the Evacuation Army.
You should have been informed of our arrival.
The tall man lingered for a few moments, studying him, then returned his nod.
I am Ascended Vern.
He offered his hand to Sonny and said in a steady voice, Welcome to LO49, Master Sunless.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 877 Disconnected. Chapter 877 Disconnected.
Sonny and his soldiers entered the fortified settlement, happy to hide from the blizzard behind its thick walls.
There, they saw teams of awakened soldiers walking between buildings as they patrolled the territory.
All of them looked tense and tired. Master Vern led them deeper into the complex, giving a wide berth to the central dome-like structure. His gait was steady and confident. I have around 100 awakened under my command, as well as close to 1,000 mundane soldiers. There are about 500 scientists and civilian staff members under our protection. Things were going fine until recently, but, as you can imagine, all of us can't wait to get away from the ocean.
Sonny raised an eyebrow. We're going fine?
Vern grimaced.
Yes.
Several gates manifested nearby, but our garrison and defenses were more than enough to keep the nightmare creatures away. However, there have already been instances of people succumbing to the spell within the walls. We suffered a few casualties because of that.
He lingered for a moment, and then asked, How is the situation outside?
Sonny shrugged.
Pretty bleak, but more or less under control.
Don't worry, we scouted a good path through the mountains on the way here.
Leading a convoy back shouldn't be impossible.
There is just one problem. Vern stopped and looked at him with a somber expression.
The communications? You lost contact with Army Command too? Sonny blinked. Yeah. Wait, too? You're cut off from the Army network as well? The local Ascended remained silent for a second, then nodded. All communications ceased around 43 minutes ago. We have failed to establish a new connection, for now. Sonny frowned. He could reluctantly accept that the rhino lacked the ability to pierce through the growing interference field enveloping Antarctica. However, a facility like LO49 should have had an immensely powerful communication array. If even they could not connect to the outside world.
Something is very wrong here. He did not know the reason for that sudden blackout, but just the consequences of not being in contact with Army Command were troublesome. They were supposed to check in with Master Jet and receive further instructions after reaching their destination.
Sonny glanced at Vern.
That is really weird. No offense, but a remote research facility in the middle of nowhere, suddenly losing contact with the outside world as we approach it, it's all a bit creepy.
This blackout wouldn't have anything to do with what the scientists are doing here, would it?
The tall ascendant smiled with the corner of his mouth.
I can see how you would think that.
However, let me assure you, the research being conducted in this installation is perfectly safe. I am not much of a scientist myself, but what they do here is purely theoretical. There are no practical experiments being conducted at the premises, so there's nothing that could have gone wrong. The worst that could have happened is someone making a mistake on a spreadsheet and being reprimanded by the old man. Sonny studied his face, found it sufficiently sincere, and shrugged.
Well, if you say so. The old man you mentioned is the VIP I am supposed to deliver to safety? Vern nodded.
Yes, the chief researcher.
He is a bit eccentric, but means well, most of the time. I was about to introduce you to him. Sonny sighed.
Lead the way, then. But we should probably solve the communication problem before that.
Sonny didn't like being blind, and becoming cut off from Army Command was similar to losing his sight.
Without the information about what was happening throughout the Antarctic Center, he felt more vulnerable than he would have preferred. Neither the Rhino nor the communication center of this research facility were currently able to establish a connection with the outside world, but there were other ways to achieve what he wanted. They were awakened, after all, and awakened were free to travel between two worlds. Even if hundreds or thousands of kilometers separated him and his cohort from Army Command and the other cohorts of the First Irregular Company, out there in the dream realm, that distance did not matter. As long as two awakened were anchored to the same citadel and visited it at the same time, they could freely exchange information even if the technological means of communication had broken down in the real world. Knowing that, he glanced at Vern and asked a very important question.
What's the status in this place?
Vern hesitated.
It was green 43 minutes ago.
Of course, with no Army Command, there would be no updates on the condition of gate interference and the potency of the call surrounding the base. However, Awakened, and especially Masters, could make a judgment on that matter themselves. They were the ones affected by the call, after all. It's just that their personal senses were not as precise as the complex calculations and observation data provided by the headquarters. That was why Army Command had issued a recommendation to only trust the verified status updates. Vern was someone who liked to do things by the book, it seemed. Sonny closed his eyes and listened to the whispers of the call.
They were so faint as to be almost non-existent.
Nothing appeared to have changed in the past 43 minutes.
He opened his eyes. Should still be green. Luster, Samara, and Kim. Go get some sleep and find out what the hell happened.
Try to get information from Colonel Jet herself or one of our captains, if you can.
We were supposed to receive more detailed orders, anyway.
With that, he would be able to find out more about the situation in about 8 hours. Considering that Sonny had to guide a convoy containing more than 1,000 people to a siege capital, he needed to know as much as he could about the condition of their supposed route.
Vern nodded. You can bunk in that building over there. The sleeping pods we have here are rather nice. The rest of the cohort followed him into another building, where they entered an elevator and descended underground.
Soon, Sonny found himself in a spacious chamber that resembled a lecture hall. There, an extremely old man in a white lab coat was discussing something with a young assistant.
Vern cleared his throat, attracting his attention. Professor, this is Master Sunless. He will be in charge of getting you out of here.
Then, he glanced at Sonny and added in a subdued tone.
Master Sunless, this is the chief researcher of LO49. Professor Abel.
64F449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 878 VIP.
Chapter 878, VIP.
There were not a lot of old people in the outskirts, where average life expectancy was rather low. However, even in the city proper, elderly were not a common sight, simply because the previous generations had been decimated by the arrival of the nightmare spell.
So, Sonny had little experience dealing with really old people.
The man in front of him, however, was not just old, he was certifiably ancient. He had to be 80 years, at least, or even older. His skin was thin like paper, with knotty blue veins clearly visible beneath it, and his neatly combed hair was completely white. The old man's eyes, however, were still brimming with sharp intelligence and awareness. This was someone who had been born long before the descent of the nightmare spell, and lived both through the terror of the dark times and the turbulent chaos of the modern era. Sonny hesitated for a moment.
Abel? The Professor Abel?
The old man smiled.
You know who I am, Master Sunless?
How flattering.
It's nice to see that the young generation still appreciates obscure scientists like me.
His assistant, a young woman with dark hair that was gathered in a bun and eyes full of attitude, sneered.
Indeed. I thought all awakened only know how to swing a sword. Sonny gave her a deadpan stare.
For your information, I am a researcher and lecturer back in the academy, with several academic publications under my name.
I only swing a sword when there's a reason to.
The assistant blinked, then looked down in embarrassment.
Oh.
Professor Abel let out a good-natured chuckle.
Don't be rude, Beth.
In any case, we'll be in your care then, Master Sunless. He looked at Sonny with curiosity, and then asked.
What department are you assigned to in the academy, if you don't mind me asking?
Sonny shrugged.
Wilderness survival.
My specialty is dream realm exploration and the history of dead languages.
Professor Abel raised an eyebrow.
Oh?
Do you, perhaps, know a brat named Julius? Sonny stared at him in bewilderment.
Teacher Julius? Of course. He is my mentor, after all.
But I wouldn't call him a brat.
With all due respect.
The old man laughed. He is to me. Julius used to be my student, you know, before awakening and choosing a different field of expertise. How is that rascal doing?
Sonny scratched the back of his head. Never in his life had he imagined hearing someone address teacher Julius as a bratty rascal.
He is doing great.
His health is good, and he is very passionate about his research. Professor Abel nodded in satisfaction.
Good, this is good. Then, Master Sunless, what happens now? Are we leaving LO49 already?
His assistant frowned and looked across the chamber, where lots of scientists were busy copying data on external storage devices and running around in something that resembled panic.
Sonny shook his head. We can't contact Army Command right now, so it's hard to say. There will be news in around 8 hours.
That is the earliest we can leave, but depending on what information comes back, there can be a delay. The young woman, Beth, sighed with relief.
Ah, great. I was afraid we will have to abandon a lot of data. We will continue preparations for departure, then.
A few moments passed in awkward silence. Finally, she looked at Sonny in confusion.
Are you not going to leave?
He grinned, then shook his head. You're in my care now, so I'll stick around. If the professor suddenly dies on my watch, well, I can say goodbye to a lot of contribution points. That would be very sad. Beth stared at him with indignation, then scoffed and left to help the scientists pack things up. At the same time, Master Vern bowed slightly and took his leave, saying that he had a lot to do.
Belle, Dorn, and Quentin left, as well. Professor Abel watched them go and sighed. Don't mind my assistant, Master Sunless. All of us are on edge these days.
Sonny shrugged.
Understandable.
After a while, he looked at the old man and asked. So, Professor, what exactly are you researching here? Also, LO49, that's a strange name for a facility.
The old man smiled. The name? Oh, it's just an abbreviation. Lunar Observatory 49, that is what it means. Have you not noticed the telescope dome when you arrived? Sonny coughed. An observatory.
So that was the purpose of that weird dome-shaped structure. Sonny had thought that it was some kind of strange magical construct, but it was just a mundane observatory. To his defense, he had never seen one of those before, at least not in real life.
Ah, yes. I did notice a dome. You're studying the moon? Professor Abel laughed. Goodness, no.
Around 100 of these observatories were built when the nightmare spell first appeared, but most of them are now sealed and abandoned.
This one had its telescope dismantled and was repurposed as a research facility, though. Sonny frowned, feeling like he was missing something.
Wait, why were these observatories constructed?
And why were they abandoned?
The old man glanced at him with curiosity. Why, they were constructed to observe the moon, of course.
There were human settlements on the moon in the past, you know, not that that is important. What is important is the nightmare spell. Sonny shook his head. I don't follow. Professor Abel lingered for a moment. Ah, you might not know this.
Actually, the first registered case of the nightmare spell infection happened in one of the moon settlements. Mind you, that doesn't mean that it was the first case, just the first documented one. No one really knows where the spell came from, but many point to Luna as its origin, or at least the point of contact. So, of course, there was a strong desire to study the moon many decades ago. Sonny looked at him with a wary expression.
Really? Wait. So what did people find out?
The old man shook his head.
Nothing.
As it turned out, staring at the moon for too long can lead to some very, very dire consequences.
After many casualties among the researchers, the LO program was discontinued, and the observatories were sealed.
I would advise you not to look at the moon too closely, young man. Actually, it's better not to think about it at all.
Sonny remained silent for a long time. Eventually, he said, All right, I guess that answers one of my questions. But what about the other? If you are not studying the moon, what are you researching here? Professor Abel smiled.
Oh. That is very simple. We are studying the nightmare spell.
More precisely, we are trying to understand its causality.
64F449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 879 Signs of Lightning.
Chapter 879 Signs of Lightning.
Sonny glanced at the old scientist with interest.
Causality? Do you mean its reason? Professor Abel smiled.
No, nothing so philosophical. What I mean is that we are exploring the cause and effect of various phenomena having to do with the spell, as well as correlations between them. Of course, our study mainly has to do with the nightmare gates, but since nothing exists in isolation, we need to consider the system in its entirety.
Sonny considered his words for a while. Is this how you make the Abel scale work?
The old man shook his head with an amused look.
That thing? No, not quite.
The so-called Abel scale is a primitive work that I and many talented colleagues of mine created in the early days of the spell. It is relatively effective for what it is supposed to do, but the solution is purely practical. It can track and predict manifestation events, but does not shine a light on how and why they are happening. Back then, we had no time to ponder such things. We needed to come up with an immediate and effective measure, limited as it might be. He sighed, and then said in a wistful tone. You see, a caveman can observe lightning and know that being hit by lightning is dangerous. Therefore, he can learn to recognize the signs of an approaching thunderstorm and take shelter from it.
However, without understanding the principles of why and how lightning appears, a caveman cannot invent a lightning rod, build a Faraday cage, or harness the power of electricity.
So, that is how our work here differs from the Abel scale. That old solution is simply a tool to recognize the signs of a thunderstorm and assign a numerical value to the probability of a lightning striking in a particular spot, while we are trying to understand its principles.
Sonny listened to the elderly scientist attentively. When else would he get a chance to converse with someone so learned and knowledgeable? Luckily, Professor Abel seemed to either be fond of educating young people in general, or was simply in a talkative mood. Deciding to use this chance to learn something new, Sonny asked, How does the Abel scale work, anyway?
The old man chuckled. Ah, it's not too complicated. You are familiar with the pulse that the manifestation of a nightmare gate produces, right? Depending on the category of a gate, it differs in potency and characteristics, spreads over a certain radius, and affects a certain volume of space. The more powerful the gate, the greater the impact. Sonny tentatively nodded, prompting Professor Abel to give him a small smile. Well, in truth, that pulse is a bit more complicated than that, because it spreads not only through space, but also through time. So, if we know what to look for, we can detect faint aftershocks of a gate impulse before it actually appears. Of course, that requires a vast and expensive network of sensors and monitoring satellites to monitor the entire globe, or at least those areas that we deem important. Sonny blinked. What exactly do you mean when you say that the impulse spreads through time, Professor? The old man looked at him and remained silent for a few moments. How do I put it? Try to imagine time as a river, young man. It always flows forward, from the past into the future, and we travel forward with its current. Now, imagine that someone threw a rock into that river. There would be ripples on its surface, wouldn't there? And those ripples, unlike the waters of the river itself, would travel both downstream and upstream. Hence, he can detect those ripples from a bit further up the stream. Sonny couldn't help but scratch his head. What Professor Abel said was not hard to understand, however, it was a bit harder to accept. Perhaps if I think about it in a different way. Sonny imagined a string of a harp. Someone plucked it in the middle, sending a vibration spreading both up and down. Downward was the furor, and upward was the past. Then, he imagined the inconceivable tapestry of fate, and the never-ending expanse of its countless strings, each stretching from nowhere to infinity. A certain event happened, making small sections of several strings tremble. Was that what the old man was talking about? A subtle frown appeared on his face. Come to think of it, does affinity to revelations, perhaps, work based on the same principle? Sonny hesitated for a bit, and then cautiously said, I think I understand? Maybe. Professor Abel smiled. Good. However, as I said, this is just a primitive solution. That solution only observes the effect without understanding the cause. And the cause, why, it is much harder to comprehend. Truth be told, I don't think that humans like us can even conceive of it in its entirety. In fact, the predominant school of modern thought states that the nightmare spell is acausal by nature, meaning that it does not even adhere to the principle of cause and effect. That it's magic, so to speak. He grimaced. I don't agree, obviously. But, anyway, trying to understand even a little bit of the causality of the spell is a daunting task, so we limit the scope of our research to a small fraction of it, namely, the nightmare gates. The old man's face darkened a little. However, even that has proved to be an insurmountable task, I'm afraid. For now. Sonny raised an eyebrow. How so? Professor Abel smiled bleakly. Oh, well, to be honest, this might sound funny to you, but we are not even sure that nightmare gates have anything to do with the nightmare spell. He seemed to have expected to be rebuked, but Sonny did not react to that statement too much. Instead, he thought for a bit and then asked calmly. Really? The old man looked at him with a bit of surprise. You are not against that idea? Sonny shrugged. During my second nightmare, I was separated from the spell for a while. I couldn't summon my memories, visit my soul sea, or even hear its voice. However, my aspect and powers were still with me. So, I figured that aspects, at least, exist outside the spell. If aspects are their own thing, why can't nightmare gates be? Oh, that doesn't mean that I'm convinced, though. I am just open to the possibility. Professor Abel looked at him with gleaming eyes. Separated from the spell? Fascinating. Young man, please, do share your experiences with me later. Sonny grinned. No problem. However, if you do publish something as a result, I'll be entitled to receive some points, right? You know, as a contributor. 648449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 880 Cause and Effect. Chapter 880 Cause and Effect. The old man chuckled and looked at his subordinates, who were packing things up in a hurry. After a while, he sighed. Whether nightmare gates are produced by the spell or not, there is definitely a connection between the two. Or rather, the three, since awakened, are also part of this equation. He grew silent after that, and then added in a more serious tone. What interests me the most, however, is which of the three came first. Sonny looked at him with surprise. Forgive me, Professor, but isn't that common knowledge? The spell came first, bringing with it the nightmares. Then, we awakened appeared as the result. He frowned slightly. Of course, common knowledge is not always trustworthy. But in this case, it seems to follow logic. Professor Abel shook his head. Who can really say? The beginnings of the spell are not documented well. Back then, the world was not in the best shape, and by the time we knew that something was happening, it was already out of our ability to prevent, contain, or control. We tried, of course, but, even then, some truths never get to become widely known, or even be put on paper at all. It is very likely that what you said is true. There are other possibilities, though, ones that would demand entirely different solutions. Sonny looked at him with a perplexed expression. What do you mean? The elderly scientist hesitated. Have you ever asked yourself this, did the spell bring nightmares with it, or did the nightmares bring the spell? Ah, forgive me. This is still too broad. Here is another question, do the nightmares produce the awakened, or do the awakened produce the nightmares? Sonny blinked. What? The old man smiled. Consider it a mental exercise. Of course, it is widely known that one becomes an awakened through surviving the first nightmare. However, after that, things become more interesting. You are too young to remember, but at the beginning of it all, the disasters of the spell descended on the waking world in stages. Otherwise, we would have never survived. Professor Abel's eyes suddenly became distant, as if he was remembering a distant past. At first, there were only those infected by the spell. Some of them became sleepers, and some became dormant abominations. Then, after the first solstice, there were awakened. However, there were also nightmare gates of the second category, and with them, more powerful creatures came into our world. Eventually, there were more sleepers, more awakened, there were also masters. But with them came more gates, and more gates that were unlike anything we had ever seen. He paused. Then there were saints. And North America. And now, we have the chain of nightmares. One can't help but wonder. Sonny did not like the sound of that. What is he trying to say? Wonder about what? The fragile old man let out a heavy sigh. This is just a scientific inquiry, Master Sunless. Don't take it close to heart. As scientists, our duty is to ask questions, and one of these questions is whether there is a correlation between the number and power of awakened in our world and the number and power of the nightmare gates that manifest here. Awakened in nightmares, which of these elements is the cause, and which is the effect? Sonny thought for a bit, then simply shook his head. Your argument has a big flaw, Professor. If there really was a correlation and we, awakened, were somehow responsible for attracting bigger and better nightmare gates, then there would not have been a Category 5 gate in North America before a bunch of Supremes ran around the world. I think you are just giving in to the desire to see patterns in the chaos that all us, humans, share. There were 3 sovereigns alive in the world right now, but there had not been any when that gate swallowed an entire continent. In any case, Sonny was not going to mention the Supremes as anything but a theoretical possibility. Professor Abel nodded with appreciation. Good thinking, young man. It is always good to have a healthy amount of skepticism. However, your point is only unassailable if we assume a crucial detail to be true. Sonny frowned. Yes? What detail? The old man looked at the scientists surrounding them and smiled with a bit of sadness. That the impact of a powerful awakened emerging only flows down the river of time as we, mortals, do. However, if it spreads like a ripple through time, just like the aftershock of a gate manifesting itself into reality, then it doesn't matter when their ascension happens. The first Supreme might appear in a few years, but the consequences of their rise could have already burdened us years ago. His fatigued eyes suddenly shone with strange light. As for the harrowing gate that destroyed North America, who knows? Maybe it is just an echo of a god emerging from the human race in a distant, dire future. Sometime later, Sonny left his shadow in the laboratory to stand watch and went to check on his soldiers. As he walked through the underground complex, his expression was dark. What Professor Abel had told him, Sonny was not exactly buying it. At least not entirely. However, he felt that there were a few nuggets of truth in what the old man believed, even if the scientists might have come to the wrong conclusions based on those theories. The ripples of time, the disasters that came from the future and thus paved the path for their eventual inception, thus creating a weird self-contained paradox. Sonny was dubious about the validity, and even sanity, of these ideas. In his experience, the simplest answer was most often correct. Professor Abel seemed to have lost sight of that fact. There was one theory, however, that made him restless. Can the ascension of many awakened really cause the growing number and intensity of the nightmare gates? He did not really see how that could be the case. After all, one had to go through a nightmare first to become awakened, not the other way around. However, if he assumed that there really was a correlation, one thing would make more sense. Walking through the dark corridors, Sonny scowled. Can this be the reason why the sovereigns are suppressing the emergence of new saints? No, more than that. Can this be the reason why none of them challenged the fifth nightmare yet? In the past, he had thought that all of this hidden oppression was just the result of the ambition and lust for power consuming Asterion, Anvil of Valor, and Kisone. But was that the only reason? Sonny let out a frustrated sigh. He simply did not know. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 881 Change of Plans. Outside, the blizzard was still rampaging across the world, drowning reality in a murky white haze. It was hard for a master like Sonny to get cold, but even still, he shivered and hurried to get back inside. Entering the building that housed the sleeping pods of the cohort members, he nodded at Vern, who was already waiting there with a somber face. By now, around 8 hours had passed since their arrival. The people Sonny had sent into the dream realm would be returning any minute now. The steady master looked at him and asked, "How did your meeting with the professor go?" Sonny shrugged. "We had an interesting talk. He is an outstanding person." It was strange, really. Professor Abel was a mundane human, but he had probably saved more lives than any awakened Sonny knew of. Without the predictive system the old man had developed, countless people would have been swallowed by the emerging gates over the decades. Sonny knew how dangerous a sudden manifestation of a gate in a populous area could be. He had faced one himself, after all. Vern silently nodded. "That he is. I hope you understand now why it is so important to deliver him and his scientists to safety, Master Sunless. Their work must continue." Sonny wanted to answer, but at that moment, the sleeping pods came to life, announcing that the people occupying them were waking up. Samara, Kim, and Luster returned almost at the same time. They climbed out of the pods and put on their clothes with dark expressions on their faces. "I guess the news is not too good." At that moment, Luster blurted, "Captain, sir. Bad, it's really bad." Sonny looked at him darkly. "I gathered as much. Speak." The three awakened looked at each other. Eventually, it was Kim who addressed the masters. "The situation is still unclear, but there was some sort of earthquake, followed by the manifestation of multiple Category 3 gates. There were also several titans that emerged. The three saints fought one of them above the strait between West Antarctica and the center, and then, communications across all the southern quadrant went down. By the time we left the Citadel, people were still trying to understand what happened." Sonny's face darkened. All of that sounded very troublesome. It seemed that the chain of nightmares had reached a qualitative change, plunging Antarctica in chaos.
What about our orders? Have you heard from Colonel Jet? Samara spoke in a subdued tone. She did pass on instructions, sir. Well, at least something went well. Judging by the heavy gazes of his subordinates, however, he would not like what they were about to say.
Master Vern frowned as he looked at the beautiful sharpshooter.
Well, what does Army Command want us to do? Samara sighed.
The region between this installation and the nearest siege capital is judged to be too dangerous to traverse. All the Antarctic center is affected, but its southern edge was seemingly hit the worst.
So, we can't go back.
The previous evacuation plan was scrapped.
Vern did not say anything, but his jaw muscles tightened.
It looked as if he was on the verge of uttering a curse, which said a lot about how dissatisfied the man was with the news. From what Sonny had observed, Vern was a very uptight and proper person.
He himself was far from feeling elated, as well.
Being stuck in a remote facility with no route of escape was not as bad as it could get, but very close to it. Sonny cursed for the both of them.
So, what? Are we supposed to just stay here and wait for death? Samara shook her head. We received new orders, sir.
Although evacuation by land seems to be impossible at the moment, the naval convoy that delivered us to Antarctica is already on the way back to pick up the second batch of refugees.
One of the vessels, battleship Ariadne, is going to be rerouted to the southern edge of the Antarctic center.
If all goes well, it will reach us in 2 to 3 weeks.
We are ordered to fortify LO-49's defenses and await its arrival.
Vern let out a relieved sigh.
I see. 3 weeks, that should be doable.
Sonny, however, was not too enthused. The thought of going back aboard a ship did not sound very alluring. On the other hand, traversing hundreds of kilometers of rugged terrain with 2,000 local soldiers and civilians, as well as no reconnaissance data from Army Command and an unknown number of Titans walking around,
seemed like an even worse idea.
He shrugged with a grimace.
I see. Well, I guess we got ourselves a small vacation. Considering that the cohort was going to spend at least 2 weeks at the research facility, Sonny told his soldiers to make themselves at home.
The Rhino was brought within the walls of the fortress, and they chose to use it as their living quarters instead of settling in one of the buildings.
The new environment
really was a welcome change.
The cohort was exhausted after a month of constant fighting, and this forced break, although unexpected, could potentially give them ample time to rest and recuperate.
If something did not go really wrong, of course.
LO-49 was a large facility and offered the members of the cohort a lot of opportunities to entertain themselves and pass time.
They could eat in the mess hall, relax in one of the recreational lounges, or even visit a small library. The most refreshing change, however, was simply being among new people. Conversing with the civilian staff of the installation reminded them of the calm times before the chain of nightmares. There were just 2 places that Sonny forbade his soldiers from approaching: the old observatory and the outer wall that oversaw the ocean. Even though the observatory had its telescope dismantled, he still didn't like it.
The ocean, meanwhile. Sonny was just prejudiced against dark water, for a good reason.
A few days passed in relative peace.
And then a week. The news coming from the north were still strangely vague and fragmented. Then,
however, that peace was spoiled by a sudden and dangerous development.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 882 Condition Yellow.
Sonny was staring at the black waves that came and went, licking the stone shore not too far away from the tall wall of the fortress. Even though he had told his soldiers to stay away from the ocean, Sonny came here once or twice every day, perhaps hoping to see the fearsome silhouette of the giant battleship emerging from the darkness. That was silly, of course, since the arrival of their ride away from LO-49 was days, or even weeks away. Still, he found himself in a contemplative mood whenever he observed the waves.
He was also reasonably sure in his ability to get away should anything other than Ariadne appear from the ocean.
The blizzard finally subsided a few hours ago, so today, Sunny saw much further than before. Not that there was anything to see. Shivering in the cold, he sighed and turned around to go find warmth inside one of the station's buildings. It was at that moment that Sunny froze and tilted his head, as if listening to something. His eyes narrowed. Crap! The maddening whispers assaulting his mind had just grown much louder. Jumping off the wall, Sunny walked quickly and soon reached the security center of the facility. There, several awakened were monitoring the sensor feeds. Vern was standing in front of a wall of screens with a dark expression on his face. Hearing Sunny's steps, he turned his head. "You felt it too?" Sunny nodded. "Yeah. It's strong." Vern closed his eyes for a few moments. "This complicates things." That was an understatement. What they sensed was the call, which had suddenly grown much stronger. That meant two things, none of them promising anything good to the people isolated inside LO-49. The first thing was rather obvious: somewhere out there, very close to the facility, one or more nightmare gates had just opened. Considering how loud the call was, Sunny was willing to bet that there were two of them, at least. The second thing was not immediately dangerous, but vastly more insidious. Vern gritted his teeth, then sighed and pressed a few buttons on the console in front of him. Then, he spoke, his voice being carried all across the fortress by the integrated speakers. "Attention all awakened personnel. This is Master Vern speaking, effective immediately. The interference status of the LO-49 facility should be considered to be changed from green to yellow. I repeat." Sunny's face was bleak. With the strength of the call growing so much, the stability of the gateway anchors of the awakened inside the fortress was bound to become weaker. It was not at the stage where falling asleep would definitely lead to being thrown into an unknown region of the dream realm, yet, but close to it. What it really meant was that, from now on, falling asleep within the walls of LO-49 was a gamble for all awakened defending it. The probability of becoming pulled away by the seed of nightmare was not high, but it was also not zero. Damnation.A. Worse still, there were the gates themselves to deal with. Considering that they had to have opened close enough to strengthen the call, the nightmare creates brought by them would undoubtedly come to visit, attracted by the smell of human souls. Finishing his announcement, Vern looked at Sunny with weary eyes. Sunny nodded. "I'm on it." For shadows burst from his figure, swiftly gliding across the floor and leaving the security center a second later. They flew across the facility, climbed its walls, and plunged into the cold dark night beyond. Vern, meanwhile, started giving orders to his subordinates. Soon, junior officers of the security force, which numbered close to a battalion, were summoned from all over LO-49. Considering their expertise and rank, the Devils were naturally included in this list. By the time everyone arrived, Sunny's shadows were already scouring the vicinity of the fortress, searching for the manifested gates. Vern briefed his people on what had happened. As he spoke, the faces of the soldiers changed slightly, knowing that they were going into battle soon. Only the irregulars remained nonchalant. Finally, Sunny sighed. "Found it." The coastal plain did not have a lot of geographic features, so it was easy to discover the menacing rift that tore apart reality. He was slightly surprised that there was only one gate, but then again, it seemed to be a potent one. As everyone stared at him, Sunny winced slightly. There is a single gate, about 3 kilometers away from the northern wall. It seemed to be Category 3. The mundane soldiers among them paled, and even awakened seemed disturbed. He did not pay them attention. "The nightmare creatures are, wait, what the hell?" He frowned. Usually, a gate disgorged nightmare creatures of similar origin, at least during the first wave. These ones, however, were all over the place. Some were comically small, while some were large. Some were bestial, while some were bipedal. It was a whole menagerie of monsters. The nightmare creatures all looked different from each other. A FIA copyright RCE scowl appeared on Vern's face. "The scavengers. We fought their kind before. They start weak, but quickly grow stronger by devouring corpses.
They inherit qualities of the things that they eat, too. Younger abominations are easy to deal with, but the older ones are truly vile. Sunny Panda copyright read for a bit. I see. Well, we seem to be in luck. There are about 300 them, and I only see 2 corrupted. The gate guardian is a demon. The soldiers shuddered and stared at him with a bit of resentment. If that was what the captain of the irregular considered luck, then what the hell could be called misfortune? 300 powerful nightmare creatures led by 2 corrupted, against 100 awakened, 2 masters, and 1,000 mundane servicemen of the local garrison. The situation did not look too good. Sunny lingered for a few moments. And then smiled. Ah, and the last piece of news. The bastards have caught our scent. So, they are already heading here. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 883 Sortie. There was not much time to prepare and make plans, since the abominations were going to reach LO 49 in mere minutes. The shrill alarms blasted throughout the facility, and power-reel spotlights ignited on its walls, flooding the snow-covered plain with light. Civilians rushed to shelters, while soldiers ran to man the defensive fortifications. Sunny and his cohort followed, summoning their memories as they calmly prepared for battle. As they walked through bitter cold, he spoke. After we deal with the nightmare creatures, everyone is to remain awake until we board the ship. You know the drill. We won't be sleeping for a week, at least. Maybe 2. Get the stimulants from Quentin and keep each other in check. The devils grumbled. They had already completed a few long missions in areas where sleep was deadly. A week was unpleasant, but doable. 2 weeks, however, was going to be a hellish challenge. I just hope that Ariadne arrives on time. It was not like they had any acceptable choice other than sit and wait. At that moment, someone called out to Sunny. Hey, you, Master Sunless, or whatever, what is going on? He looked to the side and saw Bethe Professor Abel's assistant shivering in the cold in her civilian clothes and flimsy lab coat. The young woman's hair was gathered in a bun, like always, but a few stubborn locks had wrestled free and were now dancing in the wind. Her pale face wore an irritated scowl, but he could see fear and alarm hiding behind that temperamental mask. In the past week, Sunny had spent most of his time with or near the scientists. When he was away, one of his shadows usually kept watch. He had spoken with the old man a lot, learning all kinds of things about the tumultuous times of the first generation, the world before that, and the scientific understanding or rather, the lack of it of the nightmare spell. So, he had come to know Beth rather well, too. That was why he knew for a fact that she was pretending to barely remember his name on purpose. Gods! She is even more petty than I am, eh? As the bleak steel of the undying chain appeared from nothingness and embraced his body, Sunny looked at the young woman and smiled. What do you think is going on? There's a big gate and a lot of nasty nightmare creatures coming this way. We'll go deal with them real quick. You head back, gather the scientist, and lock yourselves in the safe room. All right? She lingered for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, all right. With that, Beth turned around and ran back into the door of the research center. Sunny shook his head and continued forward. Soon, they reached the top of the northern wall and observed the vast expanse of the coastal plain. None of the abominations had reached the facility yet, but it was just a matter of time. As turret towers whined, ramping up their engines, Samara placed her rifle on the lip of the wall and looked through its scope. Vern, who was now clad in polished plate armor, holding a shield and a short sword in his hands, looked at Sunny. What do you think? Sunny remained silent for a moment. His shadows were still following the swarm of nightmare creatures, so he was studying them. He had been honest of course when he said that they were lucky. As far as Category 3 gates went, this one was surprisingly weak. He was even confused by the fact that it affected the strength of the call so much. The power of the wave of abominations brought by it was incomparable to the stone hive, for example. Back then, the irregulars had to face a whole score of corrupted creatures. This time, there were only 2, and the strongest of them was merely a demon.
Of course, the word merely could hardly be applied to a corrupted demon, but still. Finally, Sunny spoke. It is not a big deal. I will deal with the gate guardian, and you deal with the other corrupted. Awakened Kim will support you. Can you handle it? Asking an average awakened to fight a fallen abomination was not an easy request. However, asking an average master to face a corrupted one was less so, because all masters were elites by definition. There was a fundamental distinction between awakened and ascended, since most of the former had no choice in what they had become, but the latter could only be what they were by choice. So, Sunny was reasonably sure that Vern would survive a battle against a corrupted scavenger. The local master hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'll handle it. Sunny grinned. That's the spirit. With that, he stepped forward and leaped off the wall into the cold darkness below. The soldiers of the garrison seemed startled by his sudden jump, but the devils remained nonchalant. They were long accustomed to their captain's bizarre actions. Landing on the snow, Sunny considered the situation for a moment. He was thinking whether he should summon Saint. Eventually, he decided against it, for now. Her help would only be needed if the enemy turned out to be more dangerous than he had judged. Sunny did, however, summon the Sin of Solace. As his hand took hold of the onyx hilt of the beautiful longsword, ghostly whispers assaulted his mind. It was already strained by the insidious and exhausting pull of the call, so the additional burden seemed even heavier. Sunny winced and shook his head, chasing them away. So annoying. The Sin of Solace scratched at his sanity, its murmurs slowly growing clearer, louder, more insistent. At that moment, Samara's rifle discharged, and the sound of a magical slug breaking the sound barrier boomed from somewhere above. A moment later, the turrets came to life, sending a hail of tungsten rounds into the swarm of approaching abominations. Grinning, Sunny sent essence flowing into his muscles and chased after the bullets. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 884 Sinister Blade. For shadows flew across the snow, following the swarm of nightmare creatures. As a shining slug flashed through the darkness, gruesomely tearing apart one of the monsters, they surged forward and fused with a lonely figure that was running to meet the charging abominations. In the next moment, several streams of tracer rounds swept across the first row of the swarm, sending pieces of bone armor and chunks of flesh flying into the cold air. Sunny wrapped one of his shadows around his body, one around his armor, and one around his blade. The last slid past and flew back to the tall wall of the Yellow 49 installation. Its task was to find Professor Abel and stand watch, should something unexpected happen in the civilian shelter. Sadly, the turrets had not been as effective as Sunny had hoped. Several abominations were slowed down or wounded, but most of the bullets bounced off their tough hides ineffectively. The defense systems of the fortress continued to rain hellfire on the nightmare creatures, though, tearing the silent night apart with bright muzzle flashes and the thundering staccato of the fusillade. Long plumes of fire bloomed from the thick barrels of the turrets like the breath of a dragon. I need to be careful not to be shot in the back. Lunging forward, Sunny clashed with the vanguard of the approaching swarm. He did not really have time to engage with the mass of grotesque scavengers, especially because each of them possessed unique shape and abilities. Even with Sunny's power, there was a risk of drowning in the tide of abominations simply for the lack of understanding of them. Still, he could slow them down a little bit, at least. The jade blade of the Sin of Solace drew a line across an awakened monster's body, seamlessly parting it in two. Sunny was still amazed by the power of the beautiful, cursed sword. It felt so light in his hands that it almost seemed as though they were empty, and cut through the bodies of his enemies so easily as if not meeting any resistance at all. It felt like he was cutting water with a blade made of air. Despite its length, the Jade Jian was incredibly nimble and swift. It almost demanded to be used, to dance gracefully through the air while shedding rivers of blood. For that reason, Sunny had to adjust his technique a little. The Sin of Solace was comparable to the Odachi he had grown accustomed to in terms of sheer size, but it was much lighter. It had a double-edged blade, too, and a sharp point that was perfectly suited for lethal thrusts. Although the foundational mechanics of using the two-handed jian were the same, it was better suited for a more agile, swift, unpredictable, and devious swordplay. Luckily, Sunny was proficient in using all kinds of weapons and battle styles, weaving them together to achieve the optimal outcome. Not that he needed a lot of technical skill to slaughter these pathetic abominations. For these waifs, pure speed was enough. Severing the first creature in half, he shifted his weight slightly, made a step to the side, and easily beheaded another. This one was a fallen, so its flesh presented more resistance to the jade blade of the Sin of Solace. However, it was still eerily easy to cut it down.
Black blood rained on the white snow. By the time Sunny finished off the two stragglers that had broken away from the swarm, the mass of abominations already reached him. Instead of clashing with countless nightmare creatures, he simply dissolved into shadows and appeared 24 meters away, in the midst of them. The Sin of Solace whistled through the air, reaping another life. Then, he was gone again. Just like that, jumping from one abomination to another, Sunny soon reached the heart of the scavenger mob, where the gate guardian towered above the lesser creatures. The corrupted demon was different from the rest of them. It was taller, stronger, and seemed much more ancient. Most importantly, it filled Sunny with a cold feeling of dread. His intuition was ringing alarm, screaming at him that this foe was strong, dangerous, perilous, deadly. The creature resembled a giant with a body that was covered by pale, strangely organic, bone-like armor. It was littered with deep scars and signs of corrosion, but seemed almost impossible to break. On the demon's face, or rather, instead of its face, a single bone protrusion extended forward like a vicious horn. Sunny hesitated for a split second. "You're an ugly one, huh?"
Then, there was no time to think. The demon noticed him almost before Sunny had appeared from the shadows, and brought his devastating fists down, aiming to crush the enemy into a puddle of blood.
Sunny silently cursed and jumped back.
The gate guardian struck nothing but the cold ground,
splitting it open and causing a small earthquake with this single blow. A powerful shockwave spread from the point of impact, throwing several nightmare creatures down.
If a mundane human had happened to be nearby, just this shockwave alone would have been enough to rupture their organs, killing them on the spot.
Sunny,
fortunately, was not mundane. His armor and ascended body absorbed the shock, and all he felt was a little rattle. The localized earthquake, nevertheless, was violent enough to throw him to the ground.
Ah, not good.
Usually, in a battle against something so powerful, losing his footing would have meant death. A corrupted demon was fast enough to unleash a finishing blow long before the enemy managed to get back up and regain their mobility. In this case, however, no attack followed. The shadows in the place where the creature's fists landed suddenly surged forward and wrapped themselves around its wrists like black shackles. The gate guardian tried to straighten and unleash another blow, but was pulled back down by the shadow bindings. It let out a rambling growl that rolled across the battlefield like an ill omen and strained its mighty muscles. A moment later, the dark shackles exploded into a myriad of shards, and it was free again. That moment was all Sunny had needed, though.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 885 Myriad Eater.
Using the short window of opportunity, Sunny jumped back to his feet, dashed forward, and thrust his jade sword into a small crack between two plates of armor that covered the giant's knee joint. The thin blade of the Sin of Solace easily slid into it and bit into the demon's flesh, drawing a few drops of putrid black blood. That was all he had time to do before leaping back. The shallow wound Sunny had delivered was by no means mortal, or even seriously debilitating.
But it didn't need to be.
The plague of the sinister whisper had already been passed to the gate guardian by the swift jade blade.
Let's see how strong your mind is, bastard.
Even diminished by the potent mental barrier of the undying chain, the eerie whispers of the Sin of Solace were constantly assaulting his own sanity. Of course, it was strange to think of any nightmare creature as sane, they were all mad to begin with, after all.
But Sunny had high hopes. A demon was a demon, no matter how wicked, it was still a sentient being.
That sentience, which made these creatures so dangerous, could also be destroyed. The gate guardian finally unleashed another attack, this one so fast that Sunny barely had time to react. With no other choice, he gritted his teeth and blocked it with the blade of the Sin of Solace. Another shockwave exploded outward, and he was thrown back like a cannonball. Crap! Sonny flew back, smashing into several nightmare creatures on his way. Several devastating impacts rattled his entire body, and bits of broken flesh flew into the air. Landing dozens of meters away from the gate guardian, he collided against the ground, bounced, and then rolled for a bit, leaving a deep groove in the snow. Throughout all of it, there was a vicious smile on his lips, however. That was because he had managed to deliver a cut to the wrist of the demon just before his block crumbled. The giant was already near, so Sonny rose without wasting any time and dashed forward to meet him. For a short stretch of time which, nevertheless, felt like an eternity, he danced around the corrupted abomination. Diving through the shadows and using shadow manifestation, Sonny was able to just barely stay ahead of the terrifying creature by a split second. Several more shallow wounds appeared on the giant's body, drops of blood rolling down its bone armor. At first, the demon did not seem to be affected at all. Then, however, first, his movements slowed down a little, becoming slightly erratic. Then, his body grew tense. The creature twitched and suddenly struck itself in the head, as if trying to shake off a dizzy spell. The more wounds accumulated on the giant's body, the louder the whispers of the sinister blade grew. Eventually, the demon froze in an awkward pose, its arms hanging limp and its neck twisted at a strange angle. It remained motionless for few long, tense seconds. Then, a chilling roar escaped from its maw, making the world shake. What the? As the gate guardian's insanity, or whatever it was that guided its perverse sentience collapsed, an endless sea of bloodlust and frenzy seemed to overwhelm the abomination. Letting out a bestial growl, it moved again and lunged at Sonny like a mountain of muscle, bone, and murderous rage. Sonny stared at that frightening sight for a short moment, then calmly stepped through shadows and appeared 20 or so meters behind the crazed horror. His disappearance did not seem to affect the demon much. Maybe the broken abomination did not even notice it, consumed by rabid. Long arms forward, grabbed the nearest nightmare creature, and brutally ripped it apart. Then, not satisfied by the ghastly sight of the ruptured corpse, it howled and dove into the surrounding swarm, crushing and tearing bodies to shreds. Just in a few seconds, the crazed demon killed more nightmare creatures than Sonny had on his way to meet it. Damn. Looking at the rampaging gate guardian, Sonny couldn't help but shudder. Sin of Solace was truly a frightening weapon. Did it only seem so, or had the whispers of the jade blade grew a little clearer? He really felt like he could learn to understand them. If he just listened a little bit closer, a little bit longer, yes, surely, he would. The rest of the battle did not take long. Verns awakened and the devils fought the swarm of scavengers at the front, while the frenzied demon decimated its center. Many nightmare creatures tried to attack the gate guardian to save their lives, but all of them failed. Sonny did not, however. Felling a mindless enemy was infinitely easier than a cunning one, and the maddened giant seemed to have lost all its ability to think straight. Being consumed by the curse of the sinister whisper, it had turned into a rabid beast. Sonny used that to his advantage, pulling the attention of the corrupted demon toward other abominations while he methodically worked on dismantling its armor. The trick was to remain out of sight and only attack the giant from the back. Of course, navigating through the swarm of abominations without being cornered was not an easy task, but the havoc consuming the battlefield was so thorough that Sonny had even less trouble with that task than usual. Eventually, he bled the gate guardian, diminished its power with dozens of cuts, and finally pierced its black, wildly contorting heart. A few moments later, the voice of the spell reached his ears through the clamor of battle. You have slain a corrupted demon. Myriad Eater. Your shadow grows stronger. The giant's corpse crashed to the ground, making it tremble. Sonny stared at it for a moment, surprised. A corrupted demon. Suddenly, he remembered his first moments on the forgotten shore, and the monstrous shark that had almost scared him to death. It was a corrupted creature, too. Either a demon or a devil, considering the 2 soul shards that the carapace centurions later harvested from the half of the carcass that a much more harrowing being had left behind.
Who could have thought that, one day, he would be killing abominations comparable to that fearsome monstrosity? Shaking his head, Sonny brandished the Sin of Solace and looked around. It was time to clean up the rest of the mess. 64A44998838413622E4A34F7B Chapter 886 Clean Up. Although Awakened were still fighting the remnants of the scavenger swarm, the battle was more or less over. The Gate Guardian was dead, and Vern had handled the other corrupted abomination with Kim's support. Belle, Dorn, and Samara had hunted down the most dangerous Fallen while the local garrison eradicated the rest. By now, only the weakest nightmare creatures remained. They were still deadly, of course, but the scavengers did not seem too dangerous unless they were old and had devoured a lot of powerful enemies. The lesser ones even succumbed to their bestial instincts and got distracted from the fight, forgetting everything to sink teeth into the flesh of the slain members of their own kind. For them, any world was a dog-eat-dog world. Sonny prowled the battlefield for a while, searching for fallen abominations in hopes of earning a shadow fragment or two. Sadly, it seemed that there were none left. The rest of the defenders of LO-49 were quite thorough. Eventually, he gave up and joined the soldiers of the garrison in cleaning up the remaining enemies. What followed was a swift, but tedious chore. They quickly swept the field where the ground was drenched by blood and littered with the revolting corpses, slaughtering the last of the scavengers. At some point, Sonny found himself back near the corpse of the corrupted demon he had defeated. Since there was nothing much left for him to do, he decided to dig out the soul shards from the massive carcass. With these, both Luster and Kim would probably be able to fully saturate their cores, thus bringing the cohort to its optimal strength. The other members had long achieved full saturation, leaving only these two. Still, even they were awfully close. Heading for the dead giant with greed shining in his eyes, Sonny accidentally heard the subdued voices of the Awakened from the local garrison. Gods, look at that monstrosity. Damn. I heard rumors, of course, but to see it with my own eyes. He really went a corrupted demon it alone. Yeah, it was scary. I couldn't see much, but their battle must have been a fierce one. 1/3 of the whole swarm was destroyed simply because the bastards got caught in the crossfire. Can you believe that? I guess they call him Devil for a reason. Hiding a small smile, Sonny stepped close to the carcass of the Myriad Eater and raised the Sin of Solace, planning to cut through the tough bone plate on its chest. Then, however, he tilted his head a little. There were strange sounds coming from the other side of the dead giant. Nyam nyam, crunch, nom nom, slurp. Frowning, he noiselessly jumped on top of the massive corpse and looked down. There, a tiny scavenger was greedily biting into the tough flesh of the dead demon. The pathetic creature looked like a gaunt, starved gremlin that was only as tall as Sonny's knee. It had a mouthful of sharp triangular teeth, though, which were doing a surprisingly good job of tearing into the corrupted corpse. Ha! I guess even nightmare creatures have runs. As Sonny watched, the little imp tore a piece of bloody meat off with its teeth, raised its head, and swallowed the chunk of its former master's flesh with an excited snarl. It was then that the vermin noticed the human looking at him from above. Perhaps because of the omen of dread, enchantment of the Sin of Solace, or perhaps because the adolescent abomination had enough brain to feel terror in front of a superior predator, its eyes whitened in fear. The tiny scavenger froze for a moment. Then, it shrieked and dashed away from the carcass of the Myriad Eater, trying to run away. Sonny blinked. Well, that's a first. Since he didn't want to waste essence on shadow manifestation, he simply summoned the Prowling Thorn. By the time the heavy kunai manifested itself into his hand, the vile critter was already far away. Not bothered too much, Sonny aimed and sent the kunai flying. The scavenger was a split second away from dying, but at the last moment, it tripped and pathetically tumbled down. As a result, the blade of the kunai only sliced 2 fingers off its hand. Sonny scowled and pulled on the invisible string, summoning the Prowling Thorn back to throw it again. This time, he wasn't going to miss. Suppressing the whispers of the Sin of Solace and the oppressive pull of the call, he banished every other thought away and concentrated solely on the tiny figure of the fleeing imp. It was then that someone said, in a tone of cold disdain,
Fool! Sonny flinched and looked around. Ha! Who said that?
Although the familiar voice sounded as if it came from somewhere very close by, there was no one else around.
Come to think of it, Sonny knew that voice very well. It was his own voice.
Confused, he scratched the back of his head with the tip of the prowling thorn.
Was that an intrusive thought?
Because of the sudden distraction, the wounded scavenger was getting farther and farther away.
More importantly, though, Sonny's concentration was broken.
All the information he had been ignoring to make a good throw flooded into his mind.
His eyes widened. Professor! Sonny flinched and turned around, staring in the direction of the research installation.
There, deep below one of the science buildings, around 100 civilians were locked in a heavily reinforced shelter, nervously waiting for the soldiers of the garrison to announce that it was safe to come out. Professor Abel and his assistant, Beth, were among them. There was also another person in the shelter, someone who had been quietly sitting in a dark corner,
dozing off. Until a few seconds ago. No.
Sonny jumped off the demon's corpse and dove into the shadows, stepping through them to appear in the shelter.
However, he knew that he wouldn't be able to appear there in time.
A few moments was more than enough for the worst to happen. So, he made a swift decision. In the short moment that it took him to complete the shadow step, a sharp pain suddenly pierced his very being.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 887 Lapse of Judgment. Chapter 887 Lapse of Judgment.
It only took Sonny a split second to understand what had happened. One of the scientists locked in the shelter had fallen asleep. In their sleep, that person had been pulled into the first nightmare
and died.
Perhaps the trial of the spell was especially harsh, or perhaps the scientist was especially weak.
Perhaps luck was simply not on their side. In the end, it did not matter. What mattered was that the seed of nightmare in their soul bloomed, and a deadly abomination was unleashed into the waking world. Crimson blood on the white lab coat. A grotesque figure that resembled a ghastly amalgamation of a human and a monstrous mannequin made of flesh. Screams of fear, eyes full of shock.
Even though the nightmare creature had just been born, it already unleashed its murderous madness on the defenseless civilians in the shelter. Everyone was late to react, the automated defense systems, the sentries posted in the bunker, even Sonny himself. Although he was already diving into the shadows, he knew that the short moment it would take him to travel the vast distance between the blood-soaked battlefield and the shelter could mean the difference between life and death for Professor Abel.
Summoning Saint was a fast affair, but it, too, took a second or two to complete.
So, he went for a measure that would be immediate. Using shadow manifestation, he commanded the shadow that had been observing the old scientist to assume a tangible form and resist the frenzied nightmare creature. Almost instantly, a sharp pain pierced his very being. The shadow sustained damage, which meant that his soul did, too. No matter how many times Sonny had endured soul attacks, the sheer agony of them was still a shock. A single heartbeat later, he rolled out of the shadows nestling in the corners of the underground shelter and looked around, trying to evaluate the situation through the pain. It had been only several seconds since the unfortunate scientist turned into a grotesque abomination. Still, several people that had been close to the transformed monstrosity were already dead. Their severed limbs littered the floor, which was slick with blood. The creature itself was lunging at a group of terrified civilians, among whom were the dazed professor and Beth. The young woman was trying to shield the old man with her body, which was useless, considering that the creature would not be slowed down at all by her fragile mundane flesh. Screams of horror filled the air. However, the abomination seemed to be stuck in place. That was because an arrogant shadow was standing between the monstrosity and the scientist, pushing it back with a hand. Its other hand was wrapped around a bone side that had pierced the shadow's side, preventing it from cutting deeper. Unlike Sonny himself, the shadow did not show any sign of being in pain. Well, of course. The haughty bastard was utterly above breaking decorum because of a small and inconsequential thing like being skewered by a nightmare creature's blade. More than that, it would never stoop so low as to show weakness or discomfort in front of its lessers. Which was everyone. Everyone in Two Worlds was, naturally, its lesser. That guy. Right then, the haughty shadow raised one leg and kicked the abomination in the abdomen, sending it stumbling back. Then, it disappeared, turning back into a black silhouette on the floor. Its job was already done. Jumping over a body of one of the killed scientists, Sunny flashed through the underground shelter and attacked the nightmare creature before it could regain its balance. The Sin of Solace passed through the abomination without meeting almost any resistance, and then, the grisly mutant silently fell to the ground. It was only then that the sentries managed to raise their rifles, and the turrets mounted on the ceiling came to life, swinging in the direction of the dismantled abomination. Sunny had been faster than all of them. You have slain an awakened monster, Bone Slayer. But still. Standing above the dead creature, Sunny scowled, a dark expression appearing on his face. He had missed it. He had been distracted, and lost awareness of what was happening around him. That was not like Sunny. How did this happen? He had been keeping an eye on the professor even while fighting the Myriad Eater, but then, at some point, his attention was drawn elsewhere. Was it because of the call? Was it because of the Sin of Solace? Or simply because of the accumulated exhaustion of having to fight intense battles one after another? A combination of all these reasons? In any case, Sunny was not happy with himself. The pain lingering in his wounded soul served as a reminder of his failure. He had killed a corrupted demon and won the battle, but almost failed his mission. Countless people had almost died. With a grim sigh, Sunny dismissed the jade sword and the helmet of the undying chain, revealing his pale face and hair, which was damp with sweat. Then, he looked around one more time, counting the dead and observing the fearful expressions of those who survived. 6 victims, in just a few seconds. It could have been much worse. Despite this conclusion, he couldn't help but be appalled by the gruesome sight of the severed corpses laying on the floor. It was rotten luck for an awakened monster to appear as a result of a failed first nightmare. Master Sunless. You're here. One of the soldiers called out to him, still aiming at the unmoving abomination. Sunny exhaled slowly, then looked at Professor Abel, making sure that he was okay. Beth was still shielding him, slow to realize that the threat had been dealt with. Yeah. You can lower your rifles. It's dead. He lingered for a moment, and then addressed the terrified crowd of civilians. Someone failed their first nightmare, but it is over now. The battle upstairs is over, too. We won. You should all be safe now. For now. Of course, he did not say that last part aloud. Instead, Sunny stared at the bodies once again and gritted his teeth. This was the first time when a victory felt so bitter. In fact, despite having killed one of his most powerful foes yet, Sunny did not feel like he had won anything at all. Things were getting worse and worse with each day. A week, 2 weeks. How many more people would die before the Ariadne arrived to take them all away? Standing in a puddle of blood with hundreds of frightened civilians looking at him with gratitude and relief, Sunny had no answer. 648449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 888 Vanishing. After cleaning up the unexpected gate, things settled down within the walls of LO49. For the next few days, Sunny and his soldiers did not have a lot to do. They just had to rest, remain vigilant, and above all else, stay awake. That task turned out surprisingly hard for Sunny. As an Ascended, he should have had no problem with keeping himself from falling asleep for a couple of weeks. However, because of the damage his souls had sustained, he felt weak and strangely lethargic. Minutes and hours passed with an excruciating slowness, but his mental exhaustion did not seem to diminish with the passage of time. Instead, it only grew, aggravated by the insidious pressure of the call. Of course, soul wounds were not permanent. They healed naturally over time, and that one in particular was not even the worst one Sunny had ever received. The haughty shadow, too, was on its way to full recovery. The other shadows fussed around it a lot, but the arrogant guy pretended to not care. Secretly, though, he seemed to be enjoying all the attention.
Don't sleep, don't sleep, don't sleep. On top of the wall overseeing the dark ocean, Sonny pressed his forehead against the lip of the wall, and then lightly struck his head against it several times.
Ah, how annoying. There was nothing useful for him to do in the research facility, which only aggravated the dangerous feeling of boredom. They were disconnected from the network, which meant that he could not access any entertainment or receive messages from Rain. They could not travel to the dream realm, making the tiresome isolation complete. Of course, he could immerse himself in all kinds of interesting endeavors. Sonny could continue his experiments with weaving, or hold an engaging conversation with Professor Abel. He could go and check how much Luster and Kim had improved after saturating their cores. But all of that demanded mental strain, which would only make him more tired. That damned ship couldn't arrive any sooner.
As he was resentfully contemplating the situation, a lone figure ascended the wall and approached him. It was Beth, who seemed to be searching for Sonny for some reason. She was a long parka on top of the usual lab coat. He looked at her bleakly and asked,
"What?" She glowered. "What do you mean, what? Can't I look at the ocean, too?"
Sonny stared at her for a moment, then turned away.
"Be my guest." The young woman remained silent for a while.
After a minute or two passed in silence, she said awkwardly,
"Anyway, about what happened that time. I guess you are not completely useless. For a master."
Sonny smiled with a corner of his mouth.
"Is this your way of saying thank you?" Beth looked down, but then answered with unexpected sincerity. "Yes. I mean, thank you. From me and all the other scientists. If it wasn't for you, Professor might have." He studied the black waves silently. "Don't thank me. If I did my job well, that wouldn't have happened in the first place. I was negligent."
The young woman suddenly scoffed, ruining the somber mood.
"Gosh. How cool. You are very full of yourself, aren't you, Master Sunless?" Sonny simply grinned. "Naturally. Who else am I going to be full of?" Beth sighed. "Still, you are a human, too. Awakened often seem to forget that fact, so don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep the professor alive. That is enough." He nodded. "That's the plan." With that, she lingered for a few moments and then left him alone. Sonny stared into the distance, imagining the formidable silhouette of the battleship appearing on the horizon. "When I get out of this place, I'm going to sleep for a week straight." "Arg, no, don't think about sleep, sleep, sleep."
He grimaced, then slapped himself and turned around.
It was time to go and find himself a cup of strong, bitter coffee. The next morning, which was no different from the evening, a familiar figure approached the Rhino.
Sonny, who was sitting on its roof and fiddling with a stimulator patch, looked down and raised his eyebrow.
"Vern? Did something happen?" The tall ascendant looked up and remained silent for a few moments.
There were dark circles under his calm, weary eyes.
"Yes. Something happened." Sonny frowned, suddenly feeling uneasy. "Well, what is it?" Vern sighed. "One of my soldiers is missing."
The missing soldier had disappeared from the living quarters in the middle of the night. The man's absence was noticed in the morning, when he failed to assume his post. He was one of the 100 awakened of the local garrison, an experienced warrior who had been on track to becoming an officer. Tardiness was not in his nature. As Sonny and Vern walked toward the building where the soldier had resided, there was a tense atmosphere around them.
Sonny was asking the obvious questions.
"Have you searched the facility?"
The other master nodded. "Yes, every area that he could have access to. There is no sign of him anywhere." Sonny frowned.
People did not just vanish into thin air. Well, usually, they didn't, especially with no one noticing.
"What about security cameras? Did they record anything?"
Vern gritted his teeth, then shook his head.
"Most of the observation system went down during the blizzard." What little remains is almost useless because of the interference from the scavenger gate. There are no recordings that we can use. They arrived at the barracks and proceeded to the missing soldier's personal room, in front of which a few awakened were already crowding with worried expressions on their faces. Walking inside, Sonny felt his unease growing stronger. That was because there was a nothing. Nothing in the small room said that something had happened there. There were no signs of a struggle, no drops of blood, no unusual smells lingering in the air. Even with his special eyes and unnatural intuition, he could not notice anything out of the ordinary. Still, Sonny made a point of studying every small detail, both with his vision and shadow sense. He sent his shadows to sweep through the facility, too, with no result whatsoever. The soldier had, indeed, somehow vanished into thin air. After a while, Sonny looked at Vern and asked a somewhat awkward question. Could he have deserted? Vern stared at him blankly. Where would he go? Sonny nodded. Even if someone had lost their mind and decided to run away from the remote station, there was nowhere for them to go. The other master, meanwhile, gritted his teeth. I hoped that you would be able to notice something that I missed. Have you found anything? Sonny remained silent for a while. Eventually, he sighed tiredly and shook his head. No. Nothing. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. 64F449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 889 Without a trace. The awakened warrior was simply gone. The whole facility was swept, both by the soldiers of the garrison and Sonny's shadows, but no trace of him were found. Vern even made the decision to unseal the dome of the old observatory. However, there was nothing but old equipment, darkness, and dust inside. Sonny then sent his shadows to scour the coastal plain outside the fortress, hoping to discover a clue. He did not. A sense of unease and foreboding spread through the isolated fortress. As people were crowding together to alleviate this tension, Sonny, Vern, and Professor Abel gathered in the security center to have an emergency discussion. However, none of them seemed too eager to speak first. They simply had nothing to say. Eventually, Sonny rubbed his face with a sigh. Well, there are only 3 possibilities, right? Vern looked at him darkly. And they are? Sonny hesitated for a moment. First, he might have really deserted. The stern master simply shook his head. There was no hostility or defensiveness in this gesture, since Vern was not the type of leader to be insecure about his people or himself. He did not have the kind of fragile pride that would make the statement sound offensive. That is improbable. I know this awakened very well. He is a stalwart man. Sonny moved on with a shrug. Still, that would be the best outcome. The other 2 possibilities are much more troublesome. A tired frown appeared on his face. The second possibility is that he was killed, for whatever reason, by another person stationed at LO49. The killer subsequently disposed of the body and removed the signs of the crime. Considering that it is not easy for a mundane human to kill an awakened, the most likely suspect would be one of your people, Vern. Professor Abel let out a heavy sigh. Surely, you don't think that one of these brave soldiers? Sonny looked at him with a somber expression. I am just exploring what could have happened. However, don't be mistaken. We awakened are always only one step away from turning into monsters. With how much pressure Antarctica exerts on people, many will inevitably start to break. In any case, we should pay attention to those awakened that have aspects suitable for getting rid of incriminating evidence. Vern, you know your soldiers best, so this task will be on you. Vern pursed his lips, but then silently nodded. What about the last possibility? Sonny lingered for a few moments. There might be a nightmare creature that has infiltrated the facility and is now hiding somewhere within these walls. Considering that we failed to find any traces at all, it has to be either very powerful, very elusive, or both. Since I am the best scout among us, investigating this possibility will be my task. Vern remained silent for a while, then said somberly.
That sounds like a plan. However, what happens if neither of us discovers anything? Sonny looked at him. His eyes were full darkness. Then we just need to wait for the Ariadne to arrive and hope that no one else disappears. According to the last communication we had with the outside, it will reach us in 4 days at the earliest, and in 11 at the latest. Surely, we can hold out for that long. As he spoke, the persistent noise of the call kept scratching, pressing, seeping into his mind. Vern closed his eyes for a moment. Then, that is what we will do. Vern started investigating his own soldiers, while Sonny climbed back on top of the Rhino and sent his shadows to explore LO-49 for the third time that day. He had little hope of finding anything, but the thought of an elusive, uncanny horror hiding somewhere within the confines of the fortress, waiting to snatch its next victim, prevented him from remaining idle. At least he had something to do now. People locked inside the facility had already been tense and exhausted, but with a new, unknown threat looming somewhere just out of sight, their moods grew even more bleak and unstable. Most held up fine, for now, due to the hope of the Ariadne arriving soon. Sonny knew all about hope and how important it was in situations like these. While the search went on, new safety protocols went in effect. Mundane humans were prohibited from remaining alone, and a mutual responsibility system was established to keep anyone from succumbing to the first nightmare unexpectedly. Living quarters were fitted with additional sensors and alarm locks, awakened were supplied with powerful stimulants to remain awake, and so on. Many soldiers were pulled off the walls to reinforce internal patrols and make sure that the protocols were followed. There was no established tradition of dealing with a crisis like this, since the chain of nightmares had changed the rules of the game. Cut off from Army Command, Vern was forced to come up with enhanced measures on his own. Luckily, Professor Abel was able to help out. The old man still had memories of the cataclysmic descent of the spell, and of how the first generation had dealt with similar problems. Isolated from the outside world and surrounded by an unknown number of active gates, LO-49 was holding on as best as it could. But was it good enough? Sonny did not know. Damn it, damn it, damn it. To his frustration, he failed to find any proof that an unknown nightmare creature was hiding somewhere in the settlement. His shadows had explored every corner of the fortress, both above and below the ground, as well as many kilometers of the snow-covered coastal plain beyond the walls. But all of it was to no avail. Either the abomination was too cunning, possessed truly frightening powers, or it simply did not exist. Vern failed to discover anything. As well. At some point, Sonny found himself studying the spot where his cohort and the garrison of LO-49 had defeated the scavengers. Two of his shadows were sniffing around the battlefield, one was studying the distant gate, and one was keeping an eye on Professor Abel. Maybe that soldier really just ran away. I looked everywhere. There's just no sign of anything. He was almost ready to believe that theory. It was then that a tall figure approached the Rhino. Sonny shivered in the cold and walked to the edge of the APC's roof. Then looked down on Vern, experiencing a sense of déjà vu. His heart suddenly fell. What happened? Vern stared at him with a dim expression. A few long moments later, he opened his mouth and said in an even voice, "3 more people have vanished. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 890 Mutual Responsibility. 3 more people gone, and 0 new clues were found. This time, the vanished were not awakened. 1 was a mundane soldier, 1 was a scientist, and 1 was a member of the civilian support staff. They did not have anything particular in common, no thread that connected them together or to the first victim. All 3 vanished from different locations, and had been last seen at different times. Sonny and Vern silently investigated their living quarters, the areas they had been known to frequent in the settlement, and their last known locations. They did not find anything. In the process, both of them grew more and more somber. At some point, Sonny threw a suspicious look at the other master. What did he really know about Vern? Vern was a local of Antarctica, a career serviceman with a stellar record, a competent fighter, and a leader that was loved and respected by his men. His aspect centered around heat transference and physical augmentation. Not exactly something that could have been used to dispose of bodies, but then again, who said that it had to be done with an aspect ability? Almost at the same time, Vern suddenly glanced at Sonny with his usual stoic expression. His eyes, however, were cold and heavy.
I heard that you have a spatial storage memory. Sonny looked at him darkly. So what if I do?
Vern held his gaze for a few long moments, then turned away with a sigh.
This is not good. Sonny had to agree.
If the two of them were already paranoid enough to suspect each other, then the rest of the installation residents had to really be on edge. A bit of vigilance was never a bad thing, but with how pressured people already felt, one additional burden could become a spark that had the potential to cause a violent explosion.
He sighed. We have to be ready to implement measures.
Vern gave him a sideways glance.
What kind of measures?
Sonny stared at him calmly, or coldly, even.
He was so tired. Whatever kind that works.
The other master remained silent for a while.
I am confident in my people. Even exhausted and sleep-deprived, they will remain disciplined.
The civilians, however, that might be a challenge. However, the best way to resolve this issue is to prevent it from happening in the first place. For that, we need to understand what is going on and stop more people from disappearing.
Sonny lingered for a few moments.
Eventually, he shrugged.
Yeah, let's hope that we will. With that, they moved to the next item on the agenda, interviewing the witnesses.
Perhaps witnesses was the wrong word. This time, all three victims were mundanes. That meant that they had been assigned a partner by the updated safety protocols that Vern had established. They had not been supposed to remain alone at any point, not to mention long enough to vanish without a trace.
And yet, they had. The interviews did not reveal anything substantial.
The mutual responsibility partners of the three victims reported the same thing. The vanished had been with them throughout the day, but at some point disappeared, completely unnoticed. The scientist and the staff member had been gone by the time their partners woke up, and the soldier seemed to have
vanished while his comrade turned away to concentrate on servicing one of the wall turrets.
It was after the remaining soldier had reported his partner's absence that the fact that two more people were missing was discovered.
None of the three victims had been acting strangely or revealed any discomfort prior to their vanishing.
There was simply nothing for Sonny and Vern to catch, no thread they could pull to unravel the whole mystery. Their moods grew darker and darker.
While they were interviewing the witnesses, there were two deaths inside the settlement.
One was a scientist that had reported symptoms of being infected by the spell a day prior, was confined to a secure room in the installation's medical center, and quietly passed away in her sleep. Several awakened, monitoring the situation, dispatched the nightmare creature that the dead scientist had turned into, preventing the repeat of the safe room massacre. The other was a staff member that had been so afraid to fall asleep that he stole a batch of military stimulants from the same medical center. Inevitably, these stimulants, developed for awakened soldiers, had put too much strain on his body. The man collapsed and swiftly died of acute heart failure in front of dozens of frightened civilians.
Sonny and Vern received the report about the deaths right after finishing the fruitless interviews.
A heavy silence settled in the empty room, where only the two of them remained.
Eventually, Vern gritted his teeth. This is all a bit suffocating, isn't it?
The local master looked weary, but still composed and resolute. Sonny leaned back on his chair, tiredly thinking of the soft bed that was waiting for him inside the Rhino.
Yes. There are very few things that are more suffocating than powerlessness. You get used to it, though. Vern grimaced. If the two of us feel powerless, then how do the rest of them feel?
He was quiet for a bit, and then asked.
3 days. That is when the ship will arrive, right? Sonny silently shook his head. Don't expect the Ariadne to arrive at the earliest opportunity. Naval navigation is not easy. It's better to plan for the worst.
Soon, Vern made an announcement reiterating the importance of the updated safety measures and ordering all personnel at LO49 to follow them to the letter, as well as introducing stricter measures of mutual responsibility. People were forced to always stay in groups, mark their comings and goings in special ledgers, share cramped living quarters, and were confined to areas of the settlement that had to do with their direct responsibilities.
They couldn't even visit the bathroom on their own.
More soldiers had to leave their posts on the walls of the fortress to saturate the patrol schedule and stand guard inside the buildings. Every awakened with an aspect suitable for scouting was put to work monitoring the interior of the settlement.
Vern himself oversaw what little of the observation system was still functioning.
Sonny's shadows kept watch at key points of LO49.
But despite all that, throughout the next day, 6 more people went missing. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 891 Fatigue. 6 people vanished.
There were still no traces. It seemed that the killer, whoever or whatever the killer was, did not care if the person was alone or in a group.
The mutual responsibility system was not working. Everyone was scared. The next day, 7 people vanished. 4 of them were experienced awakened, some of the best soldiers Vern had.
The other 3 were scientists. On the same day, 2 more mundanes succumbed to the spell. One of them died and was eliminated, the other was still struggling somewhere out there, in the first nightmare.
Perhaps that person would become a sleeper soon.
A day after that, 12 people vanished. No clues were found, and fear continued to spread through the facility like a plague. It had yet to transform into panic, but the residents of LO49 were starting to grow restless, trapped in the suffocating atmosphere of dread, exhaustion, and doubt.
Sonny really wanted to sleep. Then, the day that the Ariadne could have arrived came.
People were uplifted a little by the excitement, but Sonny did not share in their enthusiasm. He expected the rescue to reach them no sooner than after another week.
A lot of things could happen in a week.
The Ariadne did not arrive, but a horde of nightmare creatures appeared instead, descending from the mountains. It seemed that things were not going well up north, considering that such a large swarm of abominations had been allowed to assemble and travel freely.
What was the army even doing? Isolated at the edge of the world, they had no way of knowing.
The battle was long and fierce, but ended in a decisive victory. The tired soldiers retreated back into the fortress without even bothering to burn the corpses. They would be covered by the snow soon, anyway.
Everyone felt the growing fatigue.
The mundane person who had been making their way through the first nightmare woke up as a sleeper. The next day, that sleeper disappeared, along with 14 more people.
The scavenger gate released a new wave of abominations.
There were just a handful of them, so Sonny slaughtered the nightmare creatures himself before anyone else had time to arrive. On his way back, he noticed that many of the carcasses laying under a thin veil of fresh snow seemed to be missing large chunks of flesh.
Sonny was too tired to care. I should sleep. There's nothing preventing me from sleeping. In fact, it is detrimental to remain awake. I'll think better if I rest. But that was not true.
Despite his exhaustion, Sonny's mind seemed to only become sharper. He had lost a bit of situational awareness and reaction speed, but was now able to enter a state of being laser-focused on something in exchange. He was also extremely calm, almost as if lacking the energy to feel anxious or agitated. His mind was clear. That evening, Sonny was standing on the southern wall of the fortress, looking at the undulating black ocean. The cold waves rustled as they washed over the stone expanse of the beach, carrying pieces of ice. The wind was howling, and the full moon shone in the dark sky, surrounded by an ethereal scarlet aurora.
The Ariadne was somewhere out there, illuminated by the same moon.
After some time, a lumbering figure climbed the wall and approached him.
Dorn looked as tired as the rest of them.
However, the giant man seemed to be holding up comparatively well.
Sonny turned and looked at him. "Captain, I have an idea. Can I share it?" He nodded silently.
Dorn hesitated for a few moments, and then said,
"Well, it's about the bodies. By now, we have explored every millimeter of this facility. We have searched the coastal plain extensively, too. You probably swept it all countless times. And yet, we did not find even a single drop of blood. It seems that we have searched everywhere, but actually, there is one place where we did not look. Since the bodies are not anywhere else, they had to be in that place, in the water. That is the only logical conclusion. The large man leaned on the lip of the wall. The black waves continued to sway, indifferent to his words. The unfathomable ocean remained the unchanged. Sonny was silent for a while, and then nodded.
Yeah.
That is my thinking, too. So, I'll be keeping a close eye on the beach. Somewhere in the base, one of his shadows was on its usual patrol.
Gliding past a personnel lounge, it noticed Luster, who was sitting on a couch with a glassy look in his eyes.
The young man seemed to be on the verge of dozing off. The shadow momentarily turned tangible and looked at him with disdainful reproach. Then, it slapped him across the face and disappeared. Luster jumped to his feet and looked around in shock.
What?
Who?
What? Ouch, it hurts. Back on the wall, a pale smile appeared on Sonny's face.
Dorn, that mutual responsibility protocol. You guys start following it, too. Make pairs and watch each other. Dorn nodded, lingered for a few moments, and then left.
Sonny continued staring at the ocean. This doesn't make sense.
Even if the killer disposes of the bodies by throwing them into the water, someone would have noticed something.
Dozens of people vanished already.
All of it is very strange.
While he was thinking, 2 more people ascended the wall.
One of them was an awakened soldier, and the other one was a scientist.
Sonny turned around and looked at them with a confused look on his face.
Since he was standing close to the ladder, the newcomers had no choice but to bump into him.
Sonny remained motionless for a few seconds, then took a step back to make way.
The awakened and the scientist calmly approached the lip of the wall, climbed over it, and jumped down.
One of them landed well, but the other hit the rocks and silently fell.
A disturbing sound of breaking bones could be heard, carried by the wind. Sonny rubbed his face and continued to study the ocean. The awakened walked toward the waves, while the scientist crawled. Because of that, the freezing water reached his knees, then his waist.
Then, his chest.
Finally, the awakened disappeared beneath the undulating black surface and drowned. At that time, the scientist had crawled far enough to reach the edge of the water.
His figure silently vanished into the cold waves, as well. Nothing remained of the two. Standing atop the wall, Sonny calmly looked at the ocean.
Huh?
What was I thinking about?
Ah, yes.
It is strange that no one had seen anything. How do the bodies get dumped into the ocean without anyone noticing? He did not know.
Maybe his theory was wrong, and the killer had not been using the water to hide the corpses.
The water.
It surely looked inviting. Suddenly, Sonny felt a strange urge to go for a swim. A moment later, he shivered.
A swim? What am I, crazy?
Who swims in the freezing water, during the winter, in Antarctica of all places? Shaking his head, Sonny continued to stand watch above the beach.
He had not seen anything suspicious yet.
But if he remained vigilant, he would surely discover something soon.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 892 Futility.
Sonny remained on the southern wall for 2 days, silently staring at the ocean.
In the meantime, 36 people vanished.
Some of them were awakened, and some of them were mundane. Despite safety measures growing more and more draconian, Vern had failed to prevent the disappearances.
It was all futile. And deeply, eerily frightening.
The stern master came to talk to Sonny at some point, but left more frustrated than he had been before. The fortress withstood another attack from a transient swarm of nightmare creatures. Just like the previous one, it came from the north. This time, Sonny did not participate in the battle, choosing instead to remain where he was. There were a few casualties. The awakened soldiers were all exhausted after remaining awake for more than a week.
The stimulant patches were gradually losing their effectiveness. The mundane soldiers were better rested, but much more disturbed. They were all wary of the nightmare spell. The civilians were both exhausted and afraid. They had not been trained to withstand this kind of stress, and the seemingly unknowable nature of the vanishings was pushing them to the verge of panic. If not for the sense of order established and enforced by Vern's protocols and the hope of the Eridane's nearing arrival, they would have come completely undone by now. The rescue ship was supposed to arrive in 3 or 4 days.
Sonny silently looked at the water, deep in thought.
Hearing light steps, he glanced sideways and saw Beth, who was shivering in the cold as she approached him.
"Hey, Master Sunless." He frowned. "Hey."
The young woman looked at him silently for a while, then gritted her teeth.
"What are you doing?
You've been stuck on this wall for days.
You even ignored the last attack." Sonny tilted his head a little.
When he responded, his voice sounded a bit strange.
"I'm investigating."
Beth stared at him in disbelief.
You are doing nothing and expect me to believe that it's all a part of the investigation? Please. Both you and Vern have turned out to be completely useless. So many people are gone, and the two of you failed to produce even a tiny clue. At that moment, another person appeared on the wall.
It was a mature woman in a white lab coat, with a tranquil expression on her face. Both of them moved to let her pass, not paying any attention as the woman silently climbed over the lip and jumped down. The undulating darkness of the ocean reflected in her eyes.
Sonny frowned slightly at the sound of a body hitting the rocks down below and shook his head, instantly forgetting about it. "Believe what you want."
Beth glowered at him for a bit, then sighed and turned away.
"Sorry. It doesn't matter, anyway.
We just need to persevere for a few more days, until help arrives."
"But, you promised to protect the professor.
And yet, you left him alone to sit on this wall.
That is unacceptable. Gods, how devoted can she be? Professor this, professor that, can't that girl think about herself for once? She's in danger, too."
He rolled his eyes.
"Who says I left him alone?"
"Beth. I've been watching Professor Abel and you 24 hours a day, every day, since this whole mess started."
She blinked. What? How?" Sonny scoffed. "My first specialty is scouting.
Wherever my shadows go, my gaze follows. One of them had been keeping an eye on the professor, so how do you think I was able to get to the safe room so fast, when you were attacked?" Beth looked at him for a bit. Then, suddenly, her cheeks turned red.
24 hours a day? What kind of a creep?"
Sonny palmed his face.
"Gods. Get over yourself. Do you think I have time to spy on mundane girls while all this crap is going on?"
"The point is, Professor Abel is as safe as I can make him." At that point, another person climbed to the top of the wall and jumped down. Neither of them spared them a single look, although Sonny seemed to shiver a little. Beth opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. After a long pause, she finally forced out a few words.
"Well, fine. I guess I'll be going, then." Sonny nodded. "All right."
Then, he suddenly called out to her.
"Wait, do you know my soldiers? There's a big guy called Dorn. Can you ask him to come here?"
Beth frowned, then nodded and hurriedly walked away, hoping to get away from the cold as soon as possible.
Sonny sighed. Soon, Dorn arrived.
After understanding what his captain needed, he disappeared, and returned some time later carrying recording equipment. These cameras were a bit old, but that was exactly what made them more reliable than the more modern ones. Together, they installed the cameras on the wall and stared at the screen of the terminal the recording equipment was connected to.
One more day passed. 20 people vanished.
Their passage was easily recorded by the cameras, but while Sonny and Dorn were studying the recordings, they didn't seem to notice anything strange about it. One of Vern's awakened soldiers fainted, or maybe simply fell asleep while standing at his post. Although chances of his anchor breaking were not high, that was exactly what happened. The soldier did not return from the dream realm after 8 hours passed, or even 16. Sometime later, his body went through an almost imperceptible, but eerie and frightening change. He had become hollow. His body was placed in a closed room in the medical center. Several members of the civilian staff got into a violent fight, but were dragged away from each by the sentries, isolated, and injected with sedatives. A stray nightmare creature wandered close to the fortress, and was torn apart by a rain of bullets. The thunderous noise of firing turrets made everyone inside the facility shudder. Another day passed. 22 people vanished. The moon was gone, but Sunny and Dorn were still on the wall overseeing the ocean. Standing there, Sunny looked at the dark waves, then at the screen showing the feed from the cameras, then back at the cold black water. Finally, he scratched the back of his head, pulled the memory storage device from the terminal and turned to Dorn. "We're done here. Let's go." Not waiting for a response, he turned around and headed in the direction of the security center. As Sunny walked through the settlement, many people looked at him. Some of them seemed frightened, some of them seemed angry. Some were simply numb. Everyone was exhausted. Arriving at the security center, Sunny found Vern and Professor Abel sitting in silence with dark, tired expressions on their faces. The old man looked even more fragile and ancient than usual. Sunny placed the memory storage on the table in front of them. Vern stared at it for a moment, then looked up. "Why are you here?" Sunny sat down and rubbed his hands together to warm them. A dark, ominous smile appeared on his lips. "My investigation is complete. I know why people are vanishing. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 893 negative space. Vern and Professor Abel were suddenly very focused on his words. Even Dorn, who had spent the last 2 days on the wall with Sunny, seemed to shake off his fatigue and paid rapt attention to what his captain had to say. Sunny shut his eyes for a moment. "When the first victim vanished, I said that there were only 3 possibilities: that he had deserted, that he had been killed by another human, and that a nightmare creature had infiltrated the facility. Well, I was wrong. None of these theories were correct. The third one was the closest to the truth, though." He sighed. "There is indeed a nightmare creature. Only it is not inside the fortress." Vern frowned, looking at him with dark intensity. "What do you mean?" Sunny lingered for a bit before answering. "The answer is almost obvious when you consider 2 things, and then put them together. First, the bodies. People don't just vanish without a trace, and yet we failed to find anything, not at LO49, and not on the coastal plain beyond the wall. So, the most obvious answer is that the bodies are being taken to somewhere where we can't find them, into the water. There is a whole ocean out there, after all." Vern wanted to say something, but remained silent at the end, waiting for Sunny to continue. Sunny nodded. "The second thing is the call. Its strength had a qualitative change on the day we fought the scavengers, too drastic of a change, really, to be produced by a single gate. Especially one as unimpressive as that. I remember being convinced that there were 2, at least, before exploring the plane and finding just one. I even said that we were lucky." He stared at them for a moment, and then shook his head. "However, we were not lucky. And there was, indeed, another gate, one more powerful than the scavenger gate that we cleared. We just did not find it." Professor Abel did not seem to follow his reasoning. That was only to be expected, considering that the old man did not experience the call himself. Vern, however, finally, a hint of understanding appeared on his face. "A second gate, water, you think that there is another gate? That opened underwater?" Sunny nodded. "I am more or less convinced that there is. And that is the reason why people are vanishing." Vern shook his head. "That doesn't entirely explain it all. Yes, we have pulled a lot of soldiers off the walls to augment internal patrols, but the ocean is still being watched. Nothing would have been able to crawl from beneath the waves, grab people inside the facility, and drag them back into the water unnoticed.
Sonny smiled darkly. I was just about to get to that. He rubbed his eyes tiredly. Right, we are all under a mind hex. That is why no one noticed anything.
Professor Abel, Vern, and Dorn looked at him with confusion.
Finally, the old man asked, Master Sunless, do you perhaps have a piece of evidence to substantiate your theory? Sonny simply shook his head. No. But that is exactly the point. It is the absence of evidence that proves my theory.
No matter how elusive, devious, and powerful a nightmare creature is, we should have found some kind of clue by now. Although security equipment of the facility barely works because of the interference, the cameras would have captured something. The strict protocols and mutual responsibility system Vern had implemented would have produced some result. My shadows would have found some traces. But nothing of the sort happened, which is nothing short of impossible. There is a big negative space in the place where all the results should have been. However, we can infer certain things from that negative space itself. A dark expression appeared on his face. What I am trying to say is that there are, in fact, traces. We were just rendered incapable of comprehending them. Something like that had already happened to me once. Back then, I spent an entire month being mesmerized by an insidious nightmare creature. However, I was utterly oblivious to its influence, simply for the fact the first thing that the hex did was take away my ability to become aware of its existence. I am convinced that something like that is happening to all of us right now, too. Sonny looked at Vern and Professor Abel somberly. There is a powerful gate below the surface of the water, somewhere in the vicinity of this facility. The gate brought a dreadful nightmare creature into the waking world, and that creature is using mind manipulation to both lure people into its maw and make others incapable of stopping it. An uncomfortable silence settled in the security center. Professor Abel seemed resigned, but Vern, on the contrary, was suddenly energized. If that is true, then we just have to kill that abomination. Then, everything will be resolved. There was hope and resolve in his eyes. For a warrior, having a clear enemy to fight was familiar territory. With a sigh, Sonny shook his head. No. We won't be able to kill that nightmare creature. Vern scowled. What? Why? Sonny pointed at the bleak steel of the undying chain, which he had been wearing ever since people started disappearing. Because this is a transcendent armor of the third tier. One of its enchantments provides the wearer with a high degree of protection against mind attacks. And yet, I wasn't spared from the effects of the mind hex at all. You know what that means. Vern's face suddenly grew dim. That the nightmare creature's attack is more powerful than your armor's defenses. Sonny nodded. Indeed. Which would make it of the corrupted rank, at least. My bet would be that it is a corrupted terror. Neither of us is its match, especially not in the water. We can't kill it. At that moment, Professor Abel finally spoke. So then, what should we do? Sonny remained silent for a while, looking at the memory storage device that lay on the table in front of him. Finally, he shifted slightly and said, First, we break the mind hex. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 894 Cold Waves. Sonny's plan was rather simple. Since the mental protection granted by the undying chain was not enough to break through the mind hex of the unknown horror, he just had to get better defenses. Of course, he could have summoned Saint, who was completely immune to that kind of attack. If he had no choice but to fight the abomination, which Sonny suspected to be a corrupted terror, he would do exactly that, but at this point, he was simply trying to understand what exactly was happening, and how. Considering that Saint would not be able to communicate what she saw, he had to try breaking through the hex himself, first. Several minutes later, Vern summoned the officers of his awakened force, and then sent them away with a simple task, to get every memory that could offer at least some form of protection against mind attacks to Sonny. Considering that there were still around 90 awakened soldiers at the facility, at least a couple of them had to have something like that in their arsenal. Soon, Sonny found himself in possession of several loaned memories. He was wearing the undying chain, which was his best tool to solve this situation. There was a new charm hanging around his neck, a strangely mercurial cloak on his back, and a flint dagger with a handle made out of weathered bone in his hand. The dagger came from Vern itself, so it was especially powerful. There were many people in the security center now, including Vern, Professor Abel and Beth, all 6 of his soldiers, and several sleep-deprived awakened officers.
Sonny was sitting in front of a screen, holding the memory storage device.
Taking a deep breath, he wrapped all 4 of his shadows around the undying chain and felt its bleak steel become stronger, more durable, and more powerful. Then, he inserted the memory device into the socket of the terminal and accessed the recordings stored on it.
Everyone watched the video feed of the undulating ocean with a morbid sense of curiosity.
However, none of the people present in the security center noticed anything special about the recording. After a while, Beth said in a tentative tone,
"I don't see anything?"
However, when she looked at Sonny, there was a grim expression on his pale, tired face. Because, unlike everyone else, Sonny was seeing things that he had been unable to notice earlier.
To him, the recording showed an immensely macabre reality.
The things he saw on the screen left him disturbed, shaken, and dismayed.
Damnation!
As the recording went on, replaying the shifting landscape of the lightless beach from the past 2 days at enhanced speed, Sonny slowed it down to a crawl several times, seemingly for no apparent reason. Every time, his expression turned more and more ugly. He had known, of course, to expect something like that. However, watching himself nonchalantly make way for the mesmerized victims, only to forget about their existence a moment later, was deeply unsettling. Sonny had witnessed dozens of people being swallowed by the cold waves, and yet, this was the first time his consciousness managed to become aware of that fact. As it did, the hex was broken, and suddenly, all the memories that had been suppressed before flooded his mind.
Sonny shuddered. Gods! Noticing his strong reaction, Vern leaned forward. "What is it? What do you see? What kind of nightmare creature is it? How does it capture people from within the facility?"
Sonny lingered for a moment and then stopped the playback with a trembling hand. He stared at it in confusion and made a fist, causing the tremors to stop.
Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "I was right, mostly. There is indeed a mind hex affecting everyone in this fortress.
It makes us indifferent and unaware of the victims, and the traces left behind by them.
However,
I did not see the creature itself.
It never appeared.
The victims, they just walked into the ocean themselves, and vanished.
Some right in front of our eyes.
It seems that the bastard is somehow controlling them to come to it, and us to be blind to their passing."
Vern gritted his teeth. "There has to be a way to stop it."
Sonny hesitated for a long time. "In my experience, the only way to deal with a creature like that is to run away from it.
While we can."
The other master shook his head with a resentful expression. That resentment was not aimed at Sonny, however. Instead, it was aimed at the dreadful being that hid beneath the waves, the chain of nightmares, and the sorry state of the waking world in general.
Leaving LO49 now would be no different from suicide.
We won't make it across hundreds of kilometers of rough terrain alive, not with hordes of nightmare creatures prowling this region of the Antarctic Center seemingly unopposed, with no intelligence about the state of the territory and cut off from Army command." His eyes grew cold.
"We have to remain here and wait for the Ariadne to arrive.
It should be here in 2 days, or if not, soon enough. We can survive this abomination for 2 days." Sonny looked at him for a while, thinking. Although remaining this close to a potential corrupted terror made him extremely uneasy, he had to admit that what Vern had said was reasonable.
The Ariadne, indeed, was their best chance. He sighed. "So, what do you propose we do in the meantime? Just let the bastard continue gobbling up humans?"
Vern crossed his arms and frowned.
"No.
Now that we know what is happening, we can prevent more people from vanishing."
Sonny raised his eyebrow.
And how do you propose we do that? The other master looked at him, deep in thought. After a few moments, he said calmly, "Well, someone just has to prevent the victims from jumping into the ocean. Right?" A pala smile appeared on Sunny's face. Somehow, he already knew who was going to get that job. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 895 Catcher in the Night. Sunny was the only one who could prevent more people from silently walking into the cold ocean. Even if he returned the borrowed memories and gave the undying chain to someone else, the other person would not be able to enjoy the augmentation of the four shadows. So, the mind hex would remain unbroken. If there was one good thing about the situation, it was that after Sunny had rid himself of the hex, he did not need to keep up his mental defenses at such a high level anymore. It was as though he was now inoculated against the unknown creature's influence. At least for now. He returned the charm, the mercurial cloak, and the flint dagger to their owners. One shadow continued to follow Professor Abel, while the other three remained wrapped around the undying chain, just in case. After that, everyone got to work. Although Sunny was the only person who could perceive the mesmerized, it did not mean that nobody else could help prevent more people from vanishing. Now that Vern knew what they were dealing with exactly, he could tune the safety protocols of the fortress to make it harder for the enemy to snatch victims away. Soldiers received new instructions, while all non-essential personnel were confined to their living quarters. If they couldn't leave, they would most likely be unable to reach the water, after all. Sunny, meanwhile, walking onto the dark beach, he sighed, then placed an intricate wooden chair at the very edge of the rustling waves and sat down with his back to the ocean, facing the wall of the fortress. Sunny shivered in the cold wind for a few moments, leaned back, and leisurely crossed his legs. It's a bit chilly. The world was dark, and the only sounds surrounding him were the howling of the wind and the incessant murmur of the waves. Sitting with his back to the ocean was not pleasant, especially with a corrupted terror hiding somewhere beneath its lightless surface. The only thing that made Sunny feel better was the unmoving silhouette of Saint, who was hidden in the shadow of the wall with Morgan's warbow in her hands. Even then, Sunny had a lot to worry about. Would he really be able to stop people from reaching the water? Would they resist, or would they allow themselves to be brought back inside L049? Most importantly, what would the terror do if its source of sustenance was suddenly cut off? Somehow, Sunny doubted that the creature was going to just leave them be. He just had to hope that the rescue ship would arrive before the eventual retaliation, and take them away before the creature could cast its hex on the crew, as well. With a sigh, Sunny released his shadows and sent them forward. The shadows climbed the wall and separated, assuming watching positions in 3 different spots. Then, all he could do was wait and listen to the rustle of the waves behind him. A minute passed, then another. Then, a few more. Sunny opened a thermos he had brought with him and poured himself a cup of fragrant coffee. Sipping it in the bitter cold, he continued to wait and pretend that the ocean did not concern him at all. After about an hour, a human figure finally appeared on the wall. Sunny slapped himself in the face to chase away sleepiness, then put the thermos down and stood up. One step through the shadows brought him to the mesmerized person. The man, he knew that man. It was one of the awakened officers in charge of the local garrison. This soldier had usually been cheerful and energetic, even after staying awake for close to 2 weeks. But now, there was a blank, empty expression on his face, and no light in his hollow eyes. Sunny stood between the slowly walking awakened and the lip of the wall. This time, he did not step aside to make way. Instead, he hesitated for a moment, then put his hand on the soldier's shoulder, stopping him. The man made a few more awkward steps, not realizing that he was walking in place. Then, he ceased moving and slowly turned his head, staring at Sunny with calm, glassy eyes. Damn. That's creepy. Sunny opened his mouth to say something, but at that moment, a strong blow sent him flying back. Crashing into the rampart, he broke through it and tumbled off the wall, landing on the rocks far below in an undignified heap. Arg. What the hell? The strike was much stronger than anything a mere awakened should have been able to deliver. Even without augmenting his body with the shadows, Sunny was a master. He also had 4 cores and a sea of essence at his disposal.
Why was the mesmerized officer so strong?
Cursing, he slowly rose from the ground. At the same time, the awakened landed on the rocks a few steps away from him, swayed a little, and continued marching toward the dark waves. Since Sunny was not blocking his path anymore, the soldier did not pay him any more attention.
Not so fast, you damned fool.
Creating a long chain out of the shadows, Sunny made a loop out of it and tossed it forward, ensnaring the mesmerized man. Taking the unexpected strength that the soldier had shown into account, he added another chain for good measure and grinned weakly.
Ha, just like the good old times.
The memory of throwing a chain loop at the Mountain King was still vivid and fresh in his mind. Making sure that Vern's officer was immobilized, Sunny dragged him back and then scaled the wall. A few minutes later, slightly out of breath, he reached the old observatory and walked inside. There, the first few containment units had already been built, and a working crew was hurriedly creating more. They glanced at Sunny with confusion, but then quickly lost interest, distracted by the mind hex.
Ignoring the workers, Sunny walked to the nearest unit, threw the mesmerized officer inside, and locked the door. Even for an awakened, escaping from a prison like that was not supposed to be possible. A moment later, several furious strikes landed on the walls of the containment cell from inside, making it shudder. However, in the end, the sturdy construction held. Realizing that he would not be able to break free, the mesmerized soldier walked to the corner that was the closest to the ocean, pressed against it, and froze. He just stood there, unmoving like a statue, not doing anything. Sunny slowly exhaled. Well, that's not bad.
He had been afraid that the mesmerized would bang their heads against the walls of their cages,
attempting to reach the ocean even if it was not possible. Oh. Master Sunless? When did you get here?
Now that he was not holding the soldier, the workers finally noticed his presence. They stared at Sunny with surprised eyes.
He blinked a couple of times, then smiled. Carry on. I am just passing by. At that moment, his shadows noticed another human climbing onto the wall. Sunny sighed,
lingered for a moment, and then stepped through the shadows once again.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 896 The Obstacle. Sunny felt like he was going insane. He was tired, sleep-deprived, and cold.
He was stuck in a fortress on a remote continent, which had been built around an eerie abandoned observatory. The fortress was being besieged by an unknown horror from the depths, and he was the only person who had managed to escape from the horror's hex. The strangest thing about all that, however, was that Sunny was sometimes invisible. Every time he subdued and dragged one of the victims to the containment facility built inside the old observatory, everyone in the settlement acted as though he did not exist. No, not exactly invisible, people were able to observe him. But the fact of his existence seemed to flow out of their consciousness almost immediately after being registered there. As long as Sunny was in the presence of one of the mesmerized victims, the residents of LO49 looked at him, frowned, and then went about their business, instantly forgetting what they had seen. It was really unnerving. In his exhausted state, Sunny felt a deep and irrational fear that if this went on, he would be forgotten by everyone, forever. He wondered if that was how the demon of oblivion had felt. Luckily, the bizarre effects seemed to only last for as long as Sunny was transporting prisoners to their cells. As soon as he placed them in the containment units, his existence was made normal once again. Well, as far as his existence could be called normal, to begin with. On the first day of his catcher duty, Sunny had fought, subdued, and imprisoned 29 people. His muscles were sore, and his armor was wet from being close to the water for so long. Despite his efforts, and to his relief, the terror had not reacted to the sudden obstacle that appeared in the path of its satiation. At least not yet. Saint continued to hide in the shadow of the tall wall of the fortress, monitoring the deep, dark, cold waters of the ocean.
At midnight, Sunny reported the results of his effort to Vern.
They walked over to the observatory together, where the other master remained silent for a long time.
Are you telling me that there are people in these cells? Sonny struggled with a yawn, failed to suppress it, and then nodded. Yeah. Around 30 of them. Vern stared at the cells with a deep frown for a minute or two, then shook his head in bewilderment. Strange. Even though I know that they're there, I can't see anything. To me, the cells seem empty. Sonny was a bit late to react. Oh. Believe me, they're there. They just stand near the southern side of their units and do nothing. At least they are staring at the walls, and not at us. That would be really creepy. Vern looked at him with dark amusement. I think this situation is sufficiently creepy as it is. Then, he turned away from the cells and asked in a somber tone. Any change in the terror's behavior? Sonny shook his head. No. At least not that I've noticed. Vern remained silent for a moment, and sighed. Good. Continue, then. The Ariadne should be arriving soon, so we just have to endure a little bit longer. Just like that, Sonny continued his eerie task. He waited by the water, caught the people trying to drown themselves in the ocean, and locked them up in cells while suffering from being invisible. Damn cold. He had long summoned the memory of ice and continuously fed it with essence to save himself from the chilling wind. Just like that, another day passed. During that day, Sonny rescued 35 people from being devoured by the waves. His skill of making chains out of shadows improved by a lot. A few minutes before midnight, Sonny was sitting on his chair with an empty thermos in his hand and stared at the sky. Today, there was no moon and no aurora. Only the stars remained, shining softly up above. The waves sound differently today. He rubbed his face, then turned around and stared at the undulating black surface of the ocean with intense distrust. Just then, something seemed to change about the world. Sonny frowned, but before he could do anything, another figure appeared on the wall, forcing a long sigh to escape from his lips. 40, it is accelerating. He stood up, ready to step through the shadows and subdue the 40th victim, but there was something strange about the figure. Instead of moving toward the edge of the wall like the rest of them, it stopped and raised a hand, as if signaling to him. Ha! It was Quentin. Sonny conserved his essence by jogging forward, then lowering his body slightly and mounting the wall with one inhumanly high jump. He landed on the concrete surface of the rampart, walked a few steps, and looked at Quentin with a deep frown. What? What happened? The chivalrous healer smiled, excitement shining in his eyes. Captain. The observatory, you need to see. What? Where am I? What happened? Hey! Someone! What the hell is this? Let me out! He stared, dumbfounded. These voices were coming from within the cells. They belonged to the victims he had imprisoned. Somehow, they seemed to have shrugged off the mind hex and regained their awareness. And it wasn't just them. Sonny turned his head and looked at the maintenance workers that were in charge of keeping the containment units secure. They were all speaking with excitement and glancing at the cells with relieved faces. They heard the victims, too. Which meant that the hex was not affecting them anymore, either. Thank the gods. That abomination must have left. Despite the happy circumstances, Sonny was suddenly overwhelmed by a deep, cold, urgent feeling of unease. It grasped his heart and remained there, growing slightly stronger with each second. He shivered. What is going on? 64F449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 897 Silent Ocean. After Sonny had broken through the mind hex and spent 2 days rescuing the mesmerized people, saving dozens of lives, the horror hiding in the cold black waves seemed to have left the vicinity of LO49. The victims had regained their senses, and every person in the settlement was able to see and hear them clearly once again. In the next few hours, no one showed any sign of being under the influence of the hex. The vanishings stopped. And the Ariadne was supposed to arrive soon. The exhausted, frightened, and shaken inhabitants of the fortress were tentatively starting to unwind. Their fragile hope bloomed and blossomed. However, the person most responsible for the positive change, Sunny, did not feel any of their cheer or relief. On the contrary, with each passing minute, his unease and sense of foreboding only grew stronger. He did not like what was happening, not at all. Walking through the snowy streets of the settlement, Sunny studied the lively faces of patrolling soldiers with a troubled expression on his own. It was dark and somber. Doesn't make sense. None of it makes any sense. Approaching the security center, he placed his hand on the panel of a sophisticated biometric lock. The sensor was supposed to initiate a thorough scan, but as seconds passed, nothing seemed to happen. The damn thing was on the fritz. Sunny stared at it for a moment, then sighed and banged on the heavy alloy door with his fist. Soon, it was manually unlocked from the inside by a sleepy soldier, who then allowed Sunny in. Walking inside the security center, Sunny dusted snow off his shoulders, looked around, and headed toward Vern. What is the situation? Vern sent one of his officers off with a list of orders, then looked at his younger colleague and shrugged. Nothing changed. The terror, or whatever that abomination was, seems to have truly moved on. Sunny gritted his teeth. When has a nightmare creature ever moved on? You're deluding yourself. The older master frowned. We can't know for sure, of course, but the disappearance of the hex speaks for itself. Don't sell yourself short. Although creatures capable of mind manipulation are exceedingly dangerous, they often lack direct means of launching an effective attack. Maybe it decided to search for easier prey after you proved capable of dismantling its mental attack. Sunny stared at him for a bit, then shook his head. A corrupted terror is a corrupted terror. We probably haven't seen even a fraction of its power yet, so why would it simply give up and leave? Vern tiredly rubbed his face and sighed. Do take into account that the creature's rank and class are only your conjecture. We don't really know how powerful it actually was. In any case, how else do you explain the fact that the hex is gone, and no one is vanishing anymore? Sunny hesitated for a moment. Maybe it decided to change tactics. Maybe it is gathering power for a singular, overwhelming attack. Maybe it just enjoys toying with its prey. Who the hell knows? His counterpart looked away with a somber expression. Alright, but what do you want me to do? It's not like I've relaxed the security measures. We are still on high alert and prepared for battle. We are still keeping the civilians locked up and concentrating our defenses on the southern wall. I don't see what other contingencies are there to prepare. Sunny let out a frustrated sigh. All I am saying is that it's not a good time to become complacent. On the contrary, we must be preparing for a rapid escalation of the crisis. Vern stared at him blankly for a few seconds. And all I am saying is that we are already doing everything we can. No matter how small, the possibility that you are right still exists, so we must. That is my position as the officer responsible for the safety of every person inside this facility. But personally, I think that exhaustion and paranoia are getting the better of you, Sunless. It's been hard on all of us. Sunny remained silent for a bit, then said in a subdued voice. My paranoia has never led me astray, though. With that, he winced and left. Maybe I am really wrong this time. Even if I'm not, Vern is right, what else are we supposed to do? Until the damned ship arrives, there's not much more we can prepare. But why did he feel so disturbed? Why was his sense of unease so urgent? Walking out of the security center, Sunny stood in place for a while with a dark expression on his face. After some time, he noticed Luster loitering around and called him over. Yes? You wanted something, Captain? Sunny lingered for a moment, then nodded. Yeah. Gather the others and tell them to stick close to the Rhino. Also, make sure that it's ready to move, in case we need to get the hell out of this damned place in a hurry. Luster blinked a couple of times, looking at him with a startled expression. Then, he gulped. Ah. Understood, sir. I'll go do that, then. Letting the young man go.
Sonny turned south and stared at the distant wall for a bit. Frowning, he then headed toward it. The beach was cold and shrouded in darkness. Like always, the black waves continued their eternal, fruitless assault on the shore. They came and went with a wide, reverberating rustle, making it seem as though the whole ocean was breathing. His chair was still standing at the edge of the water, with an empty thermos laying on the stones nearby. Descending from the wall, Sonny slowly walked toward the water and stopped just outside its reach, staring at the vast undulating expanse of the cold ocean with a deep scowl. His tired eyes were hidden in shadows. Looking at the waves, he whispered, "Where are you, bastard? What are you planning?" Of course, the ocean remained silent. There was no response.
64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 898 Going for a Swim.
Sonny stood at the edge of the water for a while, looking at the ocean with a wary expression on his face.
Funny.
Back when he had first developed the habit of climbing the southern wall of the fortress, he stared at the ocean in hopes of witnessing the fearsome silhouette of the mighty battleship appearing from the darkness. But now that the Ariadne was about to arrive, his thoughts were far away. Eventually, Sonny sighed and finally dismissed his chair, planning to return into the warmth of the settlement. However, just before he turned away from the dark water, something attracted his attention. A subtle gleam a few steps further down the shore, revealed from beneath the retreating waves. As though bleak starlight was reflecting from a small piece of glass. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then walked a meter or two forward, stopping at the spot where he had spotted the gleaming object. A new wave rushed in, licking his armored boots. He had to wait for it to crawl back before kneeling and taking a closer look at the wet rocks. There, between them, something glistened, buried under several shards of ice. Sonny brushed the ice away and picked the object up, then stood up before the next wave came. His frown deepened. In his hand was a simple brass button, similar to those that could be found on the countless winter coats issued to soldiers of the 1st Evacuation Army as part of their kit. By itself, the button was nothing special. However, Vern and the soldiers under his command were not part of the 1st Evacuation Army. They were locals of Antarctica, and had served at LO 49 long before the Chain of Nightmares. As such, their uniforms were slightly different. In fact, they were of a far better quality, considering that the 1st Army had been assembled and outfitted in a tremendous hurry. Their kits were far better suited for cold weather, and included well-designed parkas that could keep a person warm in most dire of circumstances instead of cheap mass-produced coats. So how did this button end up here? Sonny stared at the round piece of brass for a few minutes, and then slowly looked up, facing the darkness of the ocean. There was a strangely resigned expression on his pale face. With a sigh, he closed his eyes and extended his shadow sense forward, as far as it could go. "All right. Fine. Come on, show yourself, bastard. I know you didn't leave." His senses spread forward, diving deep under the black surface of the cold water. Everywhere light reached, there were shadows, after all. And even where light never entered, there was its absence. However, Sonny did not sense the terror no matter how hard he tried. He did find something, though. 20 or 30 meters away from him, deep underwater, there was a large shape. It rested on the seabed, moving slightly from time to time as the currents pulled it back and forth. The shape was irregular and mostly flat, with a very slight curve. Its edges were sharp and jagged. That was all Sonny could say from sensing its shadow, that and the fact that the shape was not that of a living thing, considering that the shadow lacked the quality of being cast by something possessing a soul. He had no idea what it was. The ocean contained all kinds of junk, so why would he care? But for some reason, he did. Opening his eyes, Sonny looked at the undulating waves for a bit. Then, he slowly took a step forward, and then another. And then, another. The cold, freezing water reached his shins first, then his knees. Then, his waist. He shivered, gasped for breath, but continued walking forward. I am not mesmerized, am I? No, he couldn't be. He had broken the hex, his mind was his own. When the water reached his chest, Sunny took a deep breath and dove down into the black depths. Swimming in a suit of steel armor was not an easy task, even one as thin and light as the undying chain. However, he possessed strength and endurance that far surpassed a mundane human, so Sunny persisted, plunging deeper and deeper into the ocean. Despite the memory of ice hanging from a string on his neck, a cold like he had never experienced enveloped his body, making it hard for him to breathe, think, and move his limbs. Gritting his teeth, Sunny ignored it and swam toward the distant shape. After what felt like an eternity, he finally reached the seabed and pushed himself along its uneven surface, getting closer and closer to his target. Far away on the shore, Saint emerged from the shadow of the wall and approached the edge of the waves, raising her bow. If anything happened, she would be able to send an arrow flying instantly. That made Sunny feel a little better, even though he did not know how powerful the arrow would remain after piercing tens of meters of water. Considering the strength of Morgan's warbow, it should still be deadly, but the efficacy of the arrow, of course, would depend on the power of the potential enemy. Don't think about that yet. Concentrating on his task, Sunny moved forward, reached the strange shape and opened his eyes. He observed it through the mass of murky water. The shape was a piece of torn alloy. It was around 10 meters in length and slightly less in width. The tough material was viciously bent and broken, with jagged edges and deep cracks crawling through its surface. It seemed to have been torn away from a larger hole by something large and incredibly powerful. However, there was no rust on the damaged metal, suggesting that it had not spent a lot of time in the water. Sunny got closer, feeling as if he recognized the composition and characteristics of the alloy. His mind raced, trying to confirm that familiarity. He placed one hand on the cold metal, remembering. Then, his eyes narrowed, and a few bubbles of air escaped from his mouth. Of course, he knew where this strong and thick alloy was used. The same type of metal comprised the inner layers of a naval vessel's reinforced armor. The deformed mass of twisted alloy. It was a broken piece of a battleship's hull. 64A44998838413624A34F7B Chapter 899 Only Hope. Gasping for breath, Sunny rolled out of the shadows and fell on the wet rocks at the edge of the rolling waves. Streams of water flowed from his armor, and his whole body was trembling. Sea cold, so cold. Gritting his teeth, he stood up and shivered as the wind assaulted him. At that moment, not even his ascended constitution and the memory of ice could protect him from being chilled to the bone. But even then, the claws grasping his heart were much colder. Curse it! Sunny took a step forward, stumbled, then righted himself and stopped. His fists were clenched. Ariadne. It must have been the Ariadne. The broken piece of the hull, the brass button, it all made too much terrible sense. Of course, this evidence alone was not enough to make a definite conclusion, but Sunny was sure of it. His intuition told him that much. No one was coming to rescue the people trapped inside LO-49. And the terror was going to descend upon them soon, without a doubt. Suddenly forlorn, Sunny glanced at the wall of the fortress with a lost look on his face. A few moments passed, accompanied by the howling of the wind. Then, he looked down, closed his eyes, and groaned. I'm so tired. It was the cold that made him shrug off this moment of indecisiveness and start to move. No matter the situation, he had to get somewhere warm first. One step, and he was on top of the wall. A second step, and he was standing on one of the streets of the settlement. A third step, and he suddenly appeared in the corner of a research laboratory where a group of scientists, including Professor Abel and Beth, were staying under guard. The young woman was the first to notice him. She was slightly startled by the sight. Ascended Sunless? What are you doing here? Sunny looked at her and forced out a pale smile. Don't mind me. I just got cold outside. He stared at Beth with a strangely heavy expression for a few moments, and then shook his head. In any case, I'll be going now. Sunny had to see Vern first. He dried himself off, then went back to the security center, feeling the urgent sense of alarm growing louder and louder in his head. Before, Sonny had not known its source, and thought that he had days to discover it. But now, he wasn't so sure. Maybe there were only hours left before the disaster his intuition was warning him about would happen. Maybe even minutes. "You're not listening." Sonny glared at Vern as the seconds ticked away. Tick-tock. With each second, their fates were coming closer to being sealed. And yet, the tall master was being difficult. "I am listening." Sonny suppressed the desire to hit the table with his fist. Not only would the table shatter and create a lot of noise, but it would also not help his argument in any way. More than that, he was too tired, and had no energy to go around breaking furniture. "Then why the hell are you not doing anything?" Vern sighed. "What am I supposed to do?" Sonny blinked. "Gather everyone, load them into the transports, and drive away from this cursed place." "What else?" Vern looked at him for a while, his frown growing deeper. "With all due respect, Sunless, you are not making a lot of sense. You are trying to convince me that the Ariadne is not coming, but your only piece of evidence is a button and a piece of metal that you found underwater. We both know how much junk and old wreckage was left in the oceans after the dark times. That armor fragment could have come from anywhere, rust or no rust." Sonny wanted to answer in anger, but managed to hold himself back. Vern was not wrong to doubt his rather unsubstantiated theory. Any good leader would question the validity of such information. The problem was that Vern did not have the benefit of being intimately connected to the strings of fate, like Sonny was. He did not have Sonny's intuition. He was blind to fate. "Listen, this is what my gut is telling me. Staying here would be a terrible mistake." Nevertheless, Vern remained unmoved. He lingered for a few moments, and then shook his head. His next words sounded polite, but had a sense of weight to them. "I can't gamble with the lives of 1,400 people because of your gut, Sunless." "This damned fool." Sonny let out a frustrated sigh. Vern was an experienced government officer. From their brief but intense partnership, it had become clear that he was reserved, methodical, and did things by the book. He had received orders from Army Command to reinforce LO 49 and wait for the naval rescue, and that was what he was determined to do. Breaking an order was not an easy thing for him. His mind was not flexible enough. "You have to admit that I at least might be right. So, staying is also a gamble. We are outside the parameters of standard procedure, Vern. Can't you think for yourself, for once?" Although that last statement was a bit rude, Vern did not react much. He just stared at Sonny with his usual serious expression, then turned away and sighed. A few moments later, he said quietly, "It doesn't matter, anyway." Sonny scowled. The words caught him by surprise. What the hell does he mean? "What?" The older master looked down. "Sunless. We are cut off from Army Command. The situation in the north is bad. We don't know how bad, but it has to be dire for so many nightmare creatures to travel freely through the mountains. The last thing we heard was that several titans had emerged. We don't even know if any of the siege capitals still stand." As he spoke, his tired face grew darker and darker. "The terrain between here and the last known encampment of the first evacuation army is a maze, with countless swarms of abominations prowling in the dark. Our tech is barely working, if at all. Our soldiers are all exhausted or on the verge of collapse. What I am trying to say is that a convoy transporting hundreds of civilian non-combatants won't survive the journey. Not with what we have left to protect it." Vern gritted his teeth. "So, it's not that I refuse to entertain the idea that the Ariadne won't arrive. It's that I can't. Because that ship is our only hope." His words echoed in the empty room of the security center, making Sonny feel even colder. 64A449988341362E4A34F7B Chapter 900 Don't Look Back. A somber silence settled in the conference room of the security center. Eventually, Vern was the first to break it. Straightening, he looked at Sonny and said in a heavy tone,
The best I can do is ask for volunteers among my awakened. To risk falling asleep. Some of them might die, but a few should return with the news from the dream realm. Then, we can discuss evacuation by land. Sunny stared at him without saying anything. His anger was suddenly gone, and instead, all that was left was fatigue, regret, and a vague feeling of dark resentment. Damn it all. If Vern indeed sent volunteers into the dream realm, even knowing that it would be a one-way trip for some of them, they would return in about 8 hours. Finding out what was happening up north would help Sunny tremendously. But 8 hours was too long. His growing panic was already almost suffocating. He did not know if they had 8 minutes left, let alone 8 hours. There's no time. You can't. Vern leaned on the table and closed his eyes for a moment. It was hard to know what was going through his mind, but Sunny somehow knew that he would not be able to convince the stern officer. His heart felt cold. Ah, that feeling, this bitter feeling. I have not tasted it in a while, I think. At that moment, Vern suddenly said, "A large convoy won't make it. But a single, robust vehicle probably can." Sunny frowned, struggling to follow the line of thought, perhaps due to his exhaustion. What exactly do you mean? The older master looked at him and shrugged with strange calmness. I mean that we don't have to put all our eggs in one basket. Your mission is not to protect every person in this facility, Sunless. Unlike mine. Your mission is to rescue one specific, high-value target. Both of us have to carry out our duty to the best of our ability, though. So, take Professor Abel, load up your APC, and leave immediately. This way, even if your theory is right, it won't be a total loss for humanity. There was a lot that had been said, and a lot that had remained unsaid. But there was no need to speak some words aloud. The two masters looked at each other for a few moments, a silent understanding between them. In the end, the corner of Sunny's mouth twitched. I still think that you are wrong. People don't know what is possible and what is impossible until they try it. Well, that was often the case, at least, in my life. Vern simply nodded. Then prove me wrong, Sunless. I wish you luck. Sunny grimaced, lingered for a second or two, and then turned around. A moment later, he was gone from the room. He had nothing more to say, and no time to waste. There was no time at all. Feeling a frightening sense of urgency, Sunny used Shadow Step to appear directly inside the research center. This time, Beth was even more surprised to see him. Wait, no way. Master Sunless, do you perchance keep frightening me just for fun? He shook his head, looked around, and then beckoned for the young woman to come closer. What he had to say needed to be kept from other ears. Frowning, Beth left Professor Abel's side and walked over to where he was standing. Grabbing her by the shoulder, Sunny unceremoniously dragged the young woman to an adjacent room. Wah, what the hell do you think you're? He closed the door and turned around, his sunken, manic eyes making Beth shudder. Be quiet and listen. There has been a change of plans. With no time to explain everything in detail, Sunny just told her the necessary parts, that the professor was in danger, and that he had to be evacuated immediately. That sudden revelation was hard to digest, and there would be a potentially fatal delay if Beth refused to listen immediately, so Sunny constructed his words in a way that played on her deeply ingrained values, loyalty to the old man and the desire to keep him alive. Beth's eyes widened. But why come to me? Why didn't you just approach the professor? Professor Abel is a noble man. He would be reluctant to leave his people to save himself, so I need you to persuade him. Fast. You know him best, after all. The young woman still did not understand. But can't we just take everyone? Her voice was small. Sunny looked at her somberly, knowing that was something that he couldn't do. My vehicle can only carry so many people. Now, go and do what I said. Every minute we waste can mean the difference between life and death. Beth nodded in a daze, then slowly turned around, rearranged her lab coat, and left the room. Sunny looked through the crack of the open door at the scientists surrounding the professor, and then turned around in shame.
However, this self-indulgence only lasted a second.
He had no time for regret, too. Not caring about the expenditure of essence, Sunny traveled through the shadows and soon appeared near the rhino. He could feel 3 shadows inside, while Luster, Kim, and Quentin were standing in front of the APC. Noticing him, they straightened their postures.
"Captain, sir."
I did as you told."
Sunny glanced at Luster and nodded. "Go and run the start-up sequence. I want the rhino to be ready to depart at any second."
The young man's eyes turned into circles, but he swiftly dove into the hatch without asking any questions. Sunny, Kim, and Quentin were left alone in the biting cold. Feeling his heart beating wildly, Sunny looked up at the sky. The sky was covered by white haze.
The blizzard is starting again. At that moment, Quentin cautiously asked, "Captain, I am sorry, but what exactly is happening?"
He gave the gallant healer a short glance.
"We're leaving." Both his subordinates seemed startled. "Leaving? Right now? But why?" Sunny lingered with the answer. "Because we have orders to keep the VIP alive." That seemed to make them stop asking questions. A minute passed, then another. His bloodstream was full of adrenaline, as though he was in the middle of a battle.
Time crawled at a snail's pace, and for some reason, Sunny felt as though he was locked inside a pillory, waiting for the guillotine's blade to come down.
"Walk faster, damn it."
His instincts were screaming that they had to leave LO49, now. Finally, 2 figures appeared from the milky white haze. Professor Abel was walking stiffly, with a troubled face. Beth was both supporting him and carrying a small bag. The old man stopped near Sunny and looked at him with a solemn expression.
He hesitated to speak. "Young man, I hear that you will be taking us away now." Sunny nodded.
"Yes, Professor."
"Get inside, please." "Hurry." "I'll explain later." They entered the rhino and closed the hatch.
While Beth was looking around with subdued curiosity, Luster sent the heavy vehicle moving. The sentries had already been informed by Vern, so they opened the gate and allowed the irregulars to drive through them.
Until the last second, Sunny was certain that something would go horribly wrong. But, somehow, it didn't.
The rhino drove away from the fortress, passed by the fleet of transports parked outside, and disappeared into the white wall of the blizzard. Only when the lights of the facility vanished from view did Sunny feel an almost overwhelming sense of relief. He leaned, almost crashed, on the bulkhead behind him and let out a trembling breath.
"We made it. We made it in time."
Although there were many confused and concerned gazes aimed at him, Sunny remained silent. Slowly, the distance between the rhino and the Lunar Observatory 49 grew larger and larger. A kilometer, then another, then a dozen.
They were leaving it behind.
Sometime later, when the heavy vehicle traversed approximately half the length of the coastal plains separating the ocean shore from the mountains, Sunny commanded Luster to stop and hide the rhino in the wreckage of a massive war machine left behind from the dark times. He closed his eyes and concentrated for a few minutes. His shadows made sure that there were no nightmare creatures laying around in wait.
After that, Sunny inhaled deeply. The call is not too strong here.
It should be condition green, so, congratulations, guys.
You can finally rest. Despite their unease and doubts, his soldiers reacted to that statement with visible excitement.
They, too, were on the verge of collapse from fatigue and exhaustion.
Luster, Kim, and Dorn.
You guys sleep first. The other 3, keep watch and take care of our guests.
They nodded, already knowing their roles.
Yes, sir.
But, Captain, what about you? Sunny looked at Bell with a dark expression. I have something to do.
He headed for the exit hatch. Beth tried to get in his way with a question, but he simply looked at her, and the young woman suddenly backed away.
Exiting the rhino, Sunny walked into the blizzard, and then summoned the nightmare. His loyal steed rose from the shadows, its eyes burning with dreadful crimson flames.
Jumping into the saddle, Sonny sent it galloping through the snow.
He left one shadow to stand guard near the rhino, of course. By now, the range at which he could control it was past 13 kilometers. That was more or less half the current distance between the rhino and LO-49. He flew back south, summoning the closed featureless helmet of the undying chain to protect himself from the cutting wind. His shadow sense spread outward, replacing sight that was useless in the furious snowstorm. Stopping at the very edge of shadow control's range, Sonny remained in the saddle and sent another shadow forward. It slid south with tremendous speed and eventually reached the walls of the facility. There were formidable turrets on them, powerful spotlights flooding the immediate vicinity of the fortress with light, snowflakes dancing in the wide beams. The gates that the rhino had left no more than an hour ago were tightly shut. A fleet of transport vehicles was parked in front of it, covered in snow, their initial purpose long forgotten. The blizzard obscured the world, and for a moment, just like when he had first arrived, Sonny felt a pang of fear. It was as though the whole facility was empty, with only ghosts populating its streets. Only, this time, his fear came true. There was no one standing watch on the walls.
No soldiers patrolled the deserted streets.
The building stood empty, with screens still showing recordings of entertainment programs, food laying on the plates, and coffee growing cold in the mugs.
But there were no people. There were no scientists in the research laboratory, and no officers in the security center. The feed of the functioning security cameras showed no movement throughout the whole settlement.
The doors of the living quarters where the civilians had been confined were still locked.
But there was no one inside.
There were no signs of struggle, and no fresh footprints in the snow covering the ground outside.
Everything was just still. 1,400 people had disappeared into thin air.
They seemed to have simply vanished. Like they had never existed at all. Many kilometers away, Sonny looked at the southern wall of the fortress through the eyes of his shadows. He felt compelled to send the shadow forward and gaze at the dark ocean once more.
But in the end, with a shiver, he decided against it.
Soon, the shadow returned. Wrapping it around his body, Sonny commanded Nightmare to turn around and rode into the blizzard without looking back.
Maybe he did not want to. And maybe he simply did not dare.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the notification bell, like, and subscribe buttons.
For me, please click the new channel's follow button.
To ensure you don't miss the footage, there is a link to subscribe to the new channel under the title. If you think this narrative is entertaining, please leave a comment saying so under the video and assist the Light Novel Podcast channel reach 1,000 likes when it posts the next segment. A little amount. This channel has a relatively small number of likes and subscribers.
Until the next clip, bye.